Chapter 270. No one knew where that powerful, ruthless, and boundless dark power came from. It was as if it had suddenly broken through space and crossed the long river of time. The originally bright sky suddenly darkened. Darkness swept across the sky and shrouded the tiny village. A wisp of flame appeared on the black piece of wood. A low sound was heard. It was the sound of the black wood cracking. The old barbarian priest's body was trembling. It was as if he had fallen into hell and was suffering endless pain. At the same time, on the hillside outside the village, Lu Chen slowly climbed up from the ground. The black fire was shrinking back from his flesh and skin. He had lost control for a moment, but he quickly regained control of the black fire in his body. However, his eyes were looking at the village from afar. He was staring at the old priest. The corner of his eyes twitched. At that moment, perhaps no one in the world could feel the pain more than him. It was the ultimate pain of the black fire burning one's body and soul. It was almost beyond the limit of what a human could endure. He had been trapped in it for 10 years. Under the illumination of the black fire, the terrifying and strange force entered the old priest's body through the black wood totem. His old body slowly swelled up like an inflated balloon. The countless red lines that spread from the black wooden block in the air also slowly turned black. The barbarians who were fighting fearlessly suddenly stopped. When the black-clothed men saw this extremely creepy scene, they couldn't help but stop and look at each other. Many of them even had the intention to retreat in their eyes. Who would have thought that this small barbarian tribe would have so many tricks up their sleeves? They thought that it would be a piece of cake. A hoarse shout came from the old priest's mouth. This shout was like an order. All the barbarians who were in a daze suddenly moved. But this time, they did not fight. They did not bite or bite. Instead, they pounced towards the men in black. The sharp light of the sword flew up and slashed fiercely. For a moment, blood splattered everywhere. But the barbarians did not care. They did not care about life and death. Even if their limbs were broken, they still charged forward bravely until they reached the men in black. Pow! A soft sound rang out from the old shaman's bulging body. A bloody hole suddenly burst open on his back. That piece of flesh instantly turned into tiny pieces of blood that splattered everywhere. And almost at the same time, a barbarian who had pounced in front of one of the men in black suddenly exploded. He had lost one of his arms. Like a terrible firework, he exploded. His flesh, blood, bones, life, and soul were instantly stimulated. The power was so great that a scream was heard. Half of the man in black who was closest to the explosion was blown away. He was flung several feet away. Then he fell to the ground and twitched. It seemed that he would not be able to live. Everyone turned pale with fright. However, everything seemed to have gone completely out of control. The terrifying power of darkness shrouded this seemingly cursed death village. On the body of the old priest, bloody holes exploded one after another. What followed after was the same explosion, and then the barbarians who wanted to perish together with the black-robed men. This was an exceptionally terrifying and despair-inducing battle. In the end, there was no victor. There was only death. The flesh and blood of the barbarians were completely stimulated by the terrible power. The men in black couldn't resist the powerful barbarians' bombs. The originally strong battle formation quickly collapsed. Finally, everyone turned around and fled. But it was useless. The barbarians lunged forward crazily as if they had all lost their minds. The number of barbarians far exceeded the number of men in black. They swarmed from all directions and perished together with the barbarians. The rumbling sound did not stop. The whole village had turned into hell. All lives were turned into nothingness in the terrible black flame. Pieces of flesh and blood fell to the ground. In front of such a terrible witchcraft, any magic, divine power, immortal sword, or magic weapon seemed to be overshadowed. But what people didn't expect was that this terrible situation lasted for a long time. It was like thunder. Not only this mountain, but for the next few decades, there were no longer any animals within a radius of several hundred miles. All the living creatures, including the demonic beasts and poisonous creatures, and even the poisonous insects in the evil Python Valley, had all fled. Everything turned into silence in the darkness. It was not until the sun reappeared and the darkness slowly receded that the village was revealed from the darkness. There was a suffocating smell of blood in the air. Looking from afar, it seemed as if there were no living people left. To be exact, perhaps there was no one left. On the hillside outside the village, Lu Chen and Atsu were stunned by this scene. They were speechless for a long time. It was the first time in Lu Chen's life that he had seen such a tragic scene. At this moment, Lu Chen's mind was also blank. After a long time, he slowly regained his composure. He looked at the village below and struggled for a moment. Then he lowered his head and said to Atsu, "You stay here, don't go over." Atsu nodded obediently and took 2 steps back. It seemed that he had no choice but to go over. Lu Chen sighed, turned around and walked down the hill. He hadn't even walked into the village when the dense smell of blood caused Lu Chen to have no choice but to hold his breath, whereas after he entered the village, the scene of a slaughterhouse of blood and flesh almost caused someone with a heart of stone like him to be unable to endure it. As far as the eye could see, there were almost no complete bodies left. Even those who died the earliest had their corpses destroyed by the aftermath of the tragic self-destruction. Lu Chen's face was a little pale, but his rationality was still strong. After pausing for a moment, he found his target and walked over. At the center of the village, the old shaman was lying on the ground next to the pile of stones that had been dyed red with blood. The old barbarian's body had almost been completely blown up. Now, there was only a remnant of his body. The blackwood was still in front of his chest. At this moment, it had also been broken into pieces and was beyond recognition. Lu Chen looked at the blackwood in shock. He thought to himself, could it be that this thing was destroyed? He squatted down and was about to pick it up to take a closer look. Suddenly, the old shaman opened his eyes. Lu Chen was taken aback. But then, he realized that the eyes of the barbarian priest had returned to normal. They were no longer blood-red in color. Instead, his eyes looked exactly like a human's, and he was staring at Lu Chen. An inexplicable heartbeat suddenly sounded in Lu Chen's ears. The power of the black fire suddenly became restless. A strange black light flashed in the deepest part of his eyes. The old shaman's lips moved. After a moment, a voice suddenly sounded in Lu Chen's ears. "Child, the god of fire has chosen you." Chapter 271. Child? God of fire? What did he choose? At that moment, Lu Chen really thought that he was hallucinating. Could it be that there was some strange and unknown power in this ghostly place that could confuse one's mind and heart? However, the next moment he looked into the eyes of the dying old priest and suddenly realized that this matter did not seem to be a joke. Although the old priest's eyes were a little dim, but he had been staring at him, not letting go. In that gaze, there was surprise, sadness, anger, but more than that, there was joy and hope. Yes, the eyes of this old man who was about to die were actually filled with hope. His cracked lips moved, but no sound came out. Not even a hoarse whimper could be heard. Lu Chen's gaze shifted downwards, and then he frowned slightly. This was because below the old priest's head, his chest and torso were almost completely blown up. Even his neck was a mess of flesh and blood. It looked extremely tragic, and basically, it was impossible for him to make any sound. As expected, I have been soft-hearted recently, and thus I am hallucinating. Lu Chen sighed in his heart, shook his head, and stretched out his hand towards the old priest's eyes, intending to close his eyes. However, at this moment, suddenly, another voice called out in his ear, "Child." Lu Chen's hand instantly stiffened, and then he slowly stepped back, once again avoiding the old priest's gaze. The old priest was now staring at Lu Chen. Lu Chen had encountered many strange things in his life, but at this moment he still felt a chill in his heart. He stared at the old shaman's eyes that seemed to be on the verge of death but refused to die. He asked in a low voice, "You called me?" The old priest's eyes slowly closed, and then opened again. Lu Chen's pupils abruptly shrank, his eyes flashed and suddenly looked down, sweeping across the remains of the old priest. After a moment, he suddenly stretched out his hand and with a crashing sound, the piece of black wood that was originally on the old priest's chest but had already broken into pieces, suddenly turned into a dozen pieces of wood and fell down, at the same time revealing another half of an old wooden staff that was originally hidden in the black wood. It looked like a very ancient wooden staff. For some reason, one end was broken, and the remaining half was covered in cracks. The wood was like ancient bronze, as if it had experienced millions of years of erosion. The only arm of the old priest that was still in good condition was tightly gripping the wooden staff. A faintly discernible and extremely weak spiritual power seemed to be emanating from the wooden staff. Lu Chen fell silent. After a while, he shifted his gaze away from the ancient wooden staff and looked at the old priest again. The old priest was also looking at him. His gaze was still complicated, but it was clearly filled with hope. Lu Chen suddenly shook his head and said, "Are you confused?" The old priest did not speak, or perhaps he could not speak at all. He only stared blankly at Lu Chen. But at the same time, that voice suddenly sounded in Lu Chen's ears. "The god of fire chose. What is the god of fire?" Lu Chen's face was cold. "I don't know what god is this, and I don't believe that there is a god in this world. You have the holy fire, you are the son of the god of fire." That voice seemed to completely ignore his response. It still spoke in an indifferent and flat tone. Lu Chen was about to refute, but suddenly realized that the other party did not seem to have any intention to argue with him. He was still talking to himself and said, "Take this fire staff, send it back to the southern wasteland holy altar, combine it with the other half of the staff, return god of fire." When it came to the last few words, there was an obvious tremor in the voice for the first time. It seemed that he was excited at this time. And at the same time, Lu Chen looked at the old priest's expression. His face was like a lamp that had run out of oil. Suddenly his muscles twitched. Lu Chen took a deep breath and shook his head. But suddenly he smiled. It was a bloody scene around him. At first glance, it seemed that he was the only one who was still in good condition. It was as if he was standing on top of a sea of blood. His eyes were filled with ridicule and self-mockery. "Your god of fire really knows how to find people." Lu Chen said, "First, he did not choose you barbarians. Second, even if he chose the human race, he chose a stray dog that could not be tolerated by the world, and could only flee to the ends of the earth. The god of fire's eyesight is not very good." Lu Chen looked at the dying old man and said. Then he emphasized the last few words. The light in the old priest's eyes gradually dimmed. Even his pupils were slowly enlarging. But after the half of the ancient wooden staff flashed slightly, the voice once again sounded in Lu Chen's ears. "Because of this, the god of fire chose you." Lu Chen's body trembled and suddenly froze. The old priest did not say anything more. After a moment, he quietly died. He stopped breathing and closed his eyes. Before he died, there was even a trace of a strange smile at the corner of his mouth. Lu Chen stared at the dead old barbarian. His eyes were a bit unkind. He always felt that there was a deep malice hidden in this old man's face, but the hope that was revealed before his death was particularly real. But what did the barbarian's hope and the old priest's expectations and dreams have to do with him? Lu Chen expressionlessly stood up. Just as he was about to leave, he immediately thought of something and his eyes once again fell on the old priest's corpse. The half of the ancient wooden staff was still tightly grasped in his hand. Lu Chen stared at the wooden staff for a while, but he still reached out to pick it up. Although the old priest was dead, his hand was still very firm on the wooden staff. Lu Chen also used a bit of strength to take the wooden staff out of his hand. But after holding it in his hand, or more accurately, after leaving the old priest's hand, the last bit of spirit force in the ancient wooden staff also disappeared. Without all of its spirit force, the wooden staff looked like an old, damaged, and mottled piece of wood. It was lifeless, withered, and cracked. Even if it was thrown on the side of the road, no one would take a second look. Lu Chen hesitated for a moment. He tried to input spirit force into the wooden staff, but the wooden staff did not respond. Lu Chen pondered for a moment and tried to use the black fire again, but he still did not see the scene he wanted. The ancient wooden staff also did not respond to the black fire. The reason why Lu Chen wanted this item was because he found that this wooden staff could actually resonate with the black fire in his body. Now that he had it in his hand, it suddenly became a waste. This made him feel a bit depressed. But at this time, He could not casually throw it away. In any case, from the old priest's words, this thing seemed to have a great origin. Chapter 272. Lu Chen turned around and walked back the way he came. Along the way, he turned his head to look at the place where the battle was the fiercest and cruelest. Those black-clothed men who were ambushed by the self-destructing barbarians and perished together with the barbarians didn't even have a single intact corpse. This unremarkable small tribe had inexplicably become the graveyard of dozens of extremely powerful cultivators. Perhaps no one would have thought of this outcome, even Lu Chen didn't think of this ending. However, even though the scene was extremely horrifying, Lu Chen didn't feel too guilty. Since a long time ago, when those black-clothed men were unwilling to let him go, the faintly discernible affection they had for each other in the past had already vanished into thin air. However, when he walked back to the mountain forest and occasionally turned his head to look into the distance, he suddenly discovered that along the way, there were already 2 additional bloody footprints on the path. It was a ghastly sight. Atsu was still waiting for him at the same place. After meeting up with them, Lu Chen thought for a moment and tried to place the wooden staff in front of Atsu. Atsu moved closer and sniffed a few times, then raised its head and looked at Lu Chen blankly. Obviously, it didn't find anything and didn't know what Lu Chen's intention was. Lu Chen sighed, shook his head and put away the wooden staff. He casually wiped his chest, and the wooden staff disappeared into thin air. This was the mysterious tree hole that he directly threw into the seed. When he had time in the future, he would carefully explore the secret of this wooden staff. However, perhaps this thing was already completely useless, Lu Chen thought in his heart. A man and a dog quickly left the mountain ridge. During this time, Lu Chen changed his clothes from head to toe. Because there were no longer these killers chasing after him, it was obvious that Lu Chen felt a lot more relaxed. This also made his mood a lot better. However, although those black-clothed men were almost all killed because of the accident, the uncomfortable feeling was still there. It was just that it wasn't as serious as before. After leaving the mountain ridge, Lu Chen hesitated, but in the end he still decided not to turn back. He still continued to flee south according to the route he had originally thought of. In this world, outside of the devil cult, there was almost no one who understood the madness of the devil cult better than him. Outside of the true Immortal Alliance, there was also almost no one who understood the strength of the floating cloud service better than him. Although those black-clothed men were powerful, even if they all died, it would not be a serious blow to the Floating Clouds Office, a shadowy organization that perfected Lord Tianlan had single-handedly created. If they didn't have this kind of foundation, the Fuyun Division wouldn't have been able to occupy the main hall of such a huge organization like the True Immortal Union for so many years, and also fight to the death with the Three Realms Devil Cult which had thousands of years of inheritance in the shadows. Lu Chen didn't want to fight against the terrifying power hidden in the shadows of Fuyunji. He also didn't have any thoughts of dying rather than surrendering. Therefore, he easily made the decision to continue fleeing. After making the decision, the next step was much easier. After all, it was only the word escape. The closest route was to pass through the evil Python Valley at the foot of the mountain. If he continued heading south, he would almost reach the Longchuan River. After passing through the Longchuan, he would probably be able to truly escape from the damned and terrifying devil cult and Fuyunji's double pursuit. Lu Chen brought Atsu all the way down the mountain ridge. He didn't stop for long and walked towards the evil Python Valley. From afar, a pungent stench wafted through the air. Atsu let out a low growl as the hair on his neck stood up. He looked extremely vigilant. Lu Chen also frowned. However, he still brought Atsu and stepped into the evil Python Valley, which was filled with danger at every corner. The evil Python Valley was actually a long and narrow valley sandwiched between several tall and majestic mountain ranges. Because of the tall mountains, this valley never saw the sun all year round. In addition, there was a lot of rain. So after a long time, this valley became extremely gloomy and humid. Under the thick green and moist leaves everywhere, countless snakes and poisonous creatures were bred. Among them, there were all kinds of poisonous snakes. After Lu Chen and Atsu walked into this valley, although it was daytime, the valley was still a little dim. They always felt that from the surrounding dense grass and trees, including the wet stone walls on both sides that were covered with moss and all kinds of strange plants, there would suddenly be some poisonous snakes and insects that would suddenly come out and bite them. Atsu looked very nervous, constantly looking left and right. Lu Chen also looked vigilant, looking to both sides from time to time. Sure enough, after they walked a few feet into the evil Python Valley, suddenly, there was a sudden rustling sound from a bush. Lu Chen and Atsu immediately stopped in their tracks. After a while, they saw a big python with a body as big as a bowl slowly slithering out of the bush. Lu Chen's face changed slightly, and he took a step back. He was on high alert, and he also looked around to see if there were any poisonous snakes or insects hiding in the dark. As for Atsu, it let out a deep roar at the big python, revealing its 2 fangs, and made a ferocious face, as if it was going to pounce on the big python and tear it into pieces in the next moment. The greenish-black python slowly raised its head and glanced at Lu Chen and Atsu. Its vertical pupils were cold and merciless, and it flicked its forked tongue in and out as it faced the 2 of them. Atsu roared twice, and it was about to move forward, but it was suddenly stopped by Lu Chen. Lu Chen looked at the big python with rapt attention, and he said in a low voice, "Wait a minute." This big python seemed to have half of its body hidden in the bush, but just its upper body that was exposed was already big enough, and it was obviously an adult python. Lu Chen wasn't afraid of such a monster, but he was worried about something else. After all, this was the evil Python Valley, and it was unknown how many snakes and insects lived here. If they made a big noise, there was no telling how many snakes and insects would be attracted, and it would be really difficult to deal with them at that time. Sure enough, after Lu Chen stopped Atsu, which was showing hostility and was eager to attack, the big python didn't immediately launch an attack. It stared at Lu Chen for the last time, and suddenly turned its head, but it slithered away, and soon disappeared into the bush on the other side. Watching the big python leave, Lu Chen breathed a sigh of relief, and then he reached out his hand to pat Atsu's head, and said, "Let's go." At this time, Atsu looked a little disappointed, and it seemed to be a little dissatisfied with the big python leaving just now. It roared twice in that direction, and then continued to walk forward with Lu Chen. However, as they went deeper, they gradually discovered something strange. In this valley where poisonous insects gathered, it seemed that many poisonous insects had come out today, even though many of them should be hiding in their nests and sleeping at this time according to their habits. And what was even more strange was that these poisonous insects didn't have any intention to attack Lu Chen and Atsu. At most, they just confronted each other out of instinct, and after Lu Chen restrained himself and showed that he was not hostile, these originally bloodthirsty poisonous insects actually left this place one after another. Who would have thought that this originally dangerous path would be abnormally smooth for them? Chapter 273. The further they walked, the more eerie and frightening this damp and gloomy evil Python Valley became. However, strangely, not a single one of those poisonous snakes and insects that should be causing great trouble for Lu Chen and Atsu jumped out to attack them. Moreover, from what they could see, some of the snakes and insects that appeared abnormally left in the same direction, as if they had sensed that something bad was about to happen. The direction that they were escaping to was the direction that Lu Chen and Atsu had come from. Lu Chen could not help but turn his head to take a look. He only saw that the road behind him was completely quiet and he could not see anything strange. Moreover, he recalled that along the way he did not see anything that could affect the evil Python Valley. Moreover, it seemed like the impact was so great. Perhaps it was only something that happened in that barbarian tribe? No matter how Lu Chen pondered, the only possibility was the tragic massacre that occurred in the barbarian tribe not long ago. When he thought of this, a thought involuntarily came to his mind. He used his hand to touch his chest, where the ancient fire god's staff was quietly lying in that mysterious tree hole. After musing for a moment, Lu Chen called out to Atsu and quickened his pace. No matter how one put it, the situation in the evil Python Valley seemed a little strange. It was best to leave as soon as possible. Otherwise, even though those poisonous snakes and insects did not have any intention of attacking them, who could guarantee that those bloodthirsty and savage demonic beasts would not go berserk in the next moment? However, as they walked, Lu Chen could not help but shake his head as he thought about the journey over the past few days. He felt a little emotional. After escaping from the snake-overgrown forest, he had been fleeing south. Originally, he thought that the two most difficult and dangerous places along the way would be the Rat Hill Mountain and the Evil Python Valley. Who knew that in the end, these two places seemed to be the easiest to pass through. On the other hand, his experience in that unassuming barbarian tribe on that small mountain was a soul-stirring experience. As he walked, Lu Chen's footsteps gradually slowed down. The feeling of being pricked appeared again, as if there was a pair of cold eyes staring at him from behind. Lu Chen's expression changed. Initially, he thought that this feeling was due to his keen intuition when he was being chased by the powerful Floating Clouds Division assassins. However, almost all of those assassins had died in the barbarian tribe on the small mountain ridge. In other words, the person who was spying on him in the dark was still following him like a maggot in his tarsal bone. What kind of enemy was this? A trace of solemnity flashed across Lu Chen's eyes. The terrain of the Evil Python Valley was twisting and turning. Even if there were no dangerous snakes or insects obstructing the way, it would still take a day to walk. When they were halfway there, they saw all kinds of strange phenomena along the way. This made Lu Chen completely certain that the strange behavior of the snakes, insects and poisonous creatures in the Evil Python Valley was indeed a mass migration. They were all leaving this dangerous valley that they had lived in for many years. This strange phenomenon became even more obvious when Lu Chen tried to take out the half of the fire god's staff. Almost all the snakes and insects immediately sped up and fled, as if they were especially afraid of the half of the fire god's staff, which looked so old and withered that it would soon turn into ashes. None of the poisonous creatures dared to go near Lu Chen and Atsu. This gave people the illusion that they were gods when they walked in this famous dangerous valley. However, this unexpected surprise did not last long. Because when Lu Chen and Atsu were about to walk out of the Evil Python Valley, they were once again ambushed. This time, it was also a group of black-clothed men. However, what was different from the previous batch was that they were real evil cult assassins. Faced with Lu Chen, this new batch of assassins were clearly much more agitated. When they saw Lu Chen's figure, their murderous aura covered the sky and covered the earth. Without any unnecessary words, they directly charged over while shouting. Lu Chen and Atsu fought and retreated as they fled towards the south with all their might. At the same time, he laughed bitterly in his heart. According to his original plan, although it would be troublesome for him to pass through these two incomparably dangerous places, the Rat Hill Mountain and the Evil Python Valley were more useful in hindering their pursuers. Who knew that with this series of strange changes, although the path was easier to walk, the pursuers' speed was much faster than expected. In terms of fighting ability, this batch of evil cult assassins was much weaker than the Fuyunji people before them. Their valiance was also far inferior. However, the evil cult side was more ferocious and crazy. Under the bone-deep hatred, once they found Lu Chen, it would be a fight to the death. This caused great trouble for Lu Chen's escape route. Along the way, when the sky darkened, Lu Chen led Atsu out of the Evil Python Valley. Behind him, there were 7 to 8 corpses. However, his body, which had almost recovered, had many new wounds. Until late at night, under the cover of the darkness and a series of treacherous methods, Lu Chen finally managed to shake off those maniacal assassins. However, the road ahead was boundless and the night was deep. Lu Chen did not feel happy at all. He knew in his heart that after dawn the next day, those evil cult assassins would definitely continue to pursue him. And as time passed, the number of evil cult assassins who wanted to kill him would definitely increase. Until he exhausted all his energy and strength, that would be the time of his miserable death. Probably, they would not leave him with a whole corpse. Lu Chen thought to himself as he dragged his bleeding body and ran for his life in the darkness. Even a moment to catch his breath seemed like a luxury. Perhaps it was because he had seen too much blood these few days, or maybe it was because he had just fought for a long time. His injuries had numbed his brain. Right now Lu Chen's mind was somewhat blank. His only instinct was probably to get away from the threat behind him and run forward with all his might. His target was the Longchuan River. As long as he passed through there, he should be free. Or perhaps he would just die there. His original intuition turned from sharp to dull and then to numb, including the vigilance that had been hidden in his heart finally relaxed involuntarily. That late at night, Lu Chen finally paid the price. He saw a ray of light suddenly lit up from the darkness. That was a sword light. That sword light, bright and vigorous, full of vigor, full of spirit and energy, wonderful to the peak, a sword directly pierced the vital point. Before he could react, his flesh and blood had already split open, his bones were broken, directly pierced into the side of Lu Chen's ribs. A sword pierced into his chest, and he had no strength to evade. At that moment he suddenly understood, the most dangerous poisonous snake had never left, but had an appalling patience, waiting until he was at his weakest and then with one sword attack, wounded the enemy. Seeing that he was about to be pierced by the sword and die on the spot, suddenly, a black shadow rushed over from the side, made a furious roar and pounced on Lu Chen. However, the sword light was so intense that it didn't retreat at all. The remaining sword light swept past, and Atu's roar instantly turned into a mournful wail. Blood splattered everywhere, and he fell beside Lu Chen. Chapter 274. Lu Chen covered the wound under his ribs with his hand, but blood still gushed out from between his fingers. He gasped for breath and felt dizzy, but he quickly gritted his teeth to stay awake. He then turned his head and looked at Atsu. Atsu's body was stained with blood, and it was also injured. The sword light had cut its hind leg, and at the same time, it swept past its tail. However, compared to Lu Chen, Atsu's injury did not seem to be a big deal. It quickly stood up, bared its fangs at the place where the sword light came from, and let out an angry growl. A figure walked out from the darkness beside them. Then, with the help of the dim light, he and Lu Chen saw each other's faces clearly. "So it's you." Lu Chen covered his wound with his hand and said in surprise. The person who walked out from the darkness was the one who sneak attacked Lu Chen and almost killed him with a sword. It was the disciple of Kunlun He. At this moment, he was dressed in a tight outfit and his face was calm. It seemed that the steady, accurate, and almost perfect sword attack just now was not something to be happy about. However, when he glanced at Atsu, who was baring its fangs and looking fierce, his eyes showed a trace of surprise and admiration. "This dog is not bad," he said. Lu Chen coughed a few times, and only felt that there was a burst of cold in his body. It was probably because too much blood had flowed from the wound under his ribs, and the heat in his body had been taken away. He raised his head and looked at He. He did not scold him, nor did he beg for mercy. Instead he asked, "When did you target me?" He also didn't seem to have any intention of making a move immediately. It was just that it was unknown whether he was toying with Lu Chen like a cat chasing a mouse, or whether he was actually somewhat fearful of this person. He said, "It's been many days. In fact, when you were at the snake forest, I had already found you." Lu Chen nodded, thinking that his intuition would not lie to him. He stared at him and suddenly asked, "Who exactly are you?" Lu Chen sneered and said, "You've chased me for so long and spent so much effort, yet you still don't know who I am? Even if I were to die, it would be too unjust." He shook his head and said, "At first I thought you are only a devil cult evildoer who sneaked into our Kunlun party to be a spy. No matter how high your position is, no matter how deep your cultivation is, I will think of a way to kill you. When I return, I will be able to give an explanation to Tianlan Zhenjuan, the senior, and that will be enough. But along the way I realized, give Tianlan an explanation?" Lu Chen suddenly interrupted him. His expression suddenly turned cold and strange. "What explanation? Did he send you here to kill me?" Thousands of mountains and rivers away, in the towering Kunlun mountain that had changed from its old appearance to a new one, everything seemed very calm. But under the calmness, it seemed that everything was changing rapidly. Of the 4 famous and world-famous floating peaks in the forbidden area among the clouds in the sky, there were now only 3 left, and the winter peak had become a ruin in the mountain range below. The person who presided over the daily affairs of the Kunlun party changed from Immortal Idol Month to Immortal Qiandeng. Although there was a temporary, in front of his title, As Immortal Idol Month quietly fell silent in the closed-door training, everyone in the Kunlun party knew that the person sitting on the throne would eventually be the real owner of that throne. Many changes had taken place in the major halls of the Kunlun party. The most important change was, of course, the change of the chief of some powerful halls. Among them, everyone expected that the chief of Baichao Tang would change from Immortal Qian Deng to Immortal Mingzhu. But no one expected that the chief of Heavenly Soldier Hall, after Dukan Jinren accidentally died in the battle with the demon beast, did not choose a successor from Heavenly Soldier Hall, nor did he let Dukan Jinren's favorite disciple He take over. Instead, he sent an equally powerful Immortal Guangyang to take over. At the same time, the Iron Branch of the Kunlun party, which had always been weak, began to rise with Masato Kihara's appropriate choice. As everyone knew, the only person in the Kunlun party, Immortal Tianlan, valued Masato Kihara very much. For the first time in many years, he allowed him and a few other Iron Branch Yuanying Zenrins to ascend the mountain among the clouds in the sky. In addition to these obvious personnel changes, there were also some faint undercurrents surging in the Kunlun party. After firmly taking control of this famous sect, Immortal Tianlan began to reorganize the sect through his subordinates. Some powerful Yuanying Zenrins, many outstanding and talented disciples in the Jindan realm and the foundation building realm were selected. They were then told that they would receive an opportunity that they had never had before to go to Zhengxianmeng to work. In the past, although Immortal Tianlan himself held a high position in Zhengxianmeng, the Kunlun party was different from the other famous sects, such as Qianji and Tianluo. They did not have the intention to be very close to or value Zhengxianmeng. Their disciples also rarely went to Zhengxianmeng to work, which formed a sharp contrast with the other big sections. The root of this was, of course, because in the past, Hakushin Jinkuan and Jinren Idol Month were in power. If they sent people to Zhengxianmeng to work, wouldn't they be helping Immortal Tianlan? Now that the situation had changed greatly, it naturally could not be mentioned in the same breath as before. But now, although his words carried enormous weight in the Kunlun mountain, Immortal Tianlan didn't seem to have any desire to covet power. He didn't interfere with most of the sect's affairs and let Qiandeng Jinren handle them himself. Under normal circumstances, he mostly stayed on the summer peak in the sky. It was rare for ordinary disciples to see him, but perhaps it was because of this detached feeling that people respected him even more. In addition, there were always people who intentionally or unintentionally added fuel to the fire in the sect. Very soon, Immortal Tianlan had a lofty, godlike status in the hearts of the numerous ordinary disciples of the Kunlun party. As for what the truth was, it actually wasn't important. One day, Tianlan once again appeared in the Black Hill Pavilion in Kunwa City. Old Ma, who was guarding this deserted and run-down shop, originally thought that this lord had some secret business or some secret person to meet here. But to his great surprise, Immortal Tianlan told him to close the door, saying that he only had something to say to him. Standing in the quiet small courtyard and looking at the tall and fat-bald Immortal Tianlan, Old Ma subconsciously became a little nervous. He slightly lowered his head to look at the ground in front of him and suddenly remembered that every time this person came, Lu Chen was always the one facing him. So, every time this person came, did Lu Chen also have this kind of apprehension in his heart? Immortal Tianlan didn't carefully observe Old Ma. After calling Old Ma over, he very directly said to him, "Pack your luggage and go to the Immortal City for me." He looked a little unhappy and even a little disgusted. Something probably happened in Fuyunji. Chapter 275. What's wrong? Old Ma was taken aback. A look of surprise appeared on his face as he asked, "What happened at the Floating Clouds Company?" Perfected Lord Tianlan snorted coldly. Shui Ying sent a message saying that after she returned to the Immortal City, the people who went to the Land of Chaos have yet to return. Old Ma shuddered. "I remember that when Shui Ying came that day, she was here. You personally told her to bring everyone back." Perfected Lord Tianlan did not speak and only looked at him indifferently. Old Ma suddenly felt a chill in his heart. "You're suspicious of Shui Ying?" Perfected Lord Tianlan frowned slightly. After a moment of silence, he said, "Not really. She's been doing well all these years and has not made any mistakes. However, this concerns Lu Chen's life and death. I believe you're the only one who wouldn't lie to me about this. Old Ma nodded silently. However, a hint of worry quickly appeared on his face. If those people don't return from the land of chaos, perfected Lord Tianlan said coldly, Shui Ying sent those people over to track and monitor Lu Chen. If they don't return, there are only two reasons. 1. Something happened to those people and they were all wiped out. 2. The order they received was not to return to the city but to hunt down Lu Chen. He looked up at Old Ma and said indifferently, Go to the Immortal City and investigate this matter in Fuyunji with my token. No matter what the reason is, whether it's not returning to the city or hunting down Lu Chen, they've disobeyed my orders. Since they dared to do this, someone has to bear the responsibility. With that, he casually waved his hand, and a round object flew over. Old Ma stretched out his hands to catch it. He looked at it carefully and saw that it was a white jade plate with two sides. The front side was engraved with the words, Tianlan, and the back side was a picture of the rising sun decorated with cloud bat patterns. Old Ma took a deep breath and held the white jade token tightly in his hand. Then he bowed to perfected Lord Tianlan and said, Don't worry, I'll definitely do this well. Perfected Lord Tianlan nodded silently. After a while, he suddenly looked up at the sky with a complicated and slightly bleak expression on his face. He said, Although that kid and I are not master and disciple, and he often speaks disrespectfully to me, no one can kill him without my permission. A trace of excitement flashed across the depths of Old Ma's eyes. He bowed and said, Yes, I understand. Go ahead. Perfected Lord Tianlan waved his hand and closed his eyes. Who sent me here to kill you? Is it important? He held the sword that was dripping with blood and stood a few feet away from the seriously injured Lu Chen. He looked at this enemy with interest and said, What I'm curious about is why you suddenly asked such a question? He smiled and gestured to the sky with his hand. Then he said calmly, The perfected Lord Tianlan we're talking about is a person of virtue and prestige. He's famous in the world. He's like an immortal. Not to mention a lowly devil cult evildoer like you, even a Jindan stage cultivator like me, who is regarded as a genius by others, may not be worthy of his attention. But when you said that, He's gaze fell on Lu Chen's face. When you said that just now, it seemed like it was natural that perfected Lord Tianlan would come to deal with you. Isn't that strange? Lu Chen covered his wound with his hand and frowned. It was unknown whether it was because of the sharp pain or because he had lost too much blood, but he shut his mouth and did not speak anymore. So, I'm very curious. What kind of person are you? He looked at him and said, An ordinary devil sect spy should not have any relationship with a perfected Lord Tianlan. Furthermore, I discovered another strange thing along the way. There were actually people from the Floating Clouds agency chasing after you. It would appear that your background is much greater than I had imagined. Lu Chen coughed painfully. He looked at He and suddenly smiled. Trying to get information from me? He shrugged his shoulders. I think we're both smart people. There's no need to talk nonsense. Tell me clearly and I'll give you a quick death. Isn't that convenient for both of us? Lu Chen sneered. Since you've been following behind, you must have seen what happened to Fuyunji people. At that kind of critical moment, you're a righteous disciple. Why didn't you go and save them? He Yi's expression changed slightly. He shook his head and said, I did see it. But my ability is limited. I can't save them. Besides, Fuyunji people are still hiding behind them. They're still hiding and not going to save them. Why should I be a busybody? Lu Chen was surprised. There are still people alive in Fuyunji? He thought for a moment. There's 1 or 2 people. They didn't even enter the village. Of course they're fine. As he spoke, he waved his hand, looking like he did not want to continue this topic. He said, But this has nothing to do with me. What I am most interested in is that a few days ago in the snake-overgrown forest, these Floating Clouds division people had clearly caught up to you, the evil cult spy, but in the end, not only did they not swarm you, they even hid their heads and tails and pretended to be evil cult killers to kill you. These things are getting weirder and weirder. I'm more and more curious about your identity. How about it? Tell me? He smiled at Lu Chen. The long sword in his hand stretched out towards him. It was also at this moment that Lu Chen's gaze, which had been staring at Yi, suddenly flashed with a hint of mockery. He said, "After talking for so long, I think I understand." He didn't like the look in Lu Chen's eyes at the moment, but his self-restraint and patience were far better than that of ordinary people. It was precisely this kind of temperament that allowed him to keep climbing up in the Kunlun sect, from an ordinary disciple with no background to the position where he was about to make a name for himself today. Only one last step left. As long as he could get that Tianlan True Lord's appreciation, as long as he could become his disciple and obtain the Tian Character Taoist title, his future path would be a broad path to immortality. Looking at the world, who could be compared with him? Therefore he was exceptionally patient. Even more patient than usual. Anyway, this Lu Chen was already seriously injured and had almost no strength to fight back. What was there for him to be afraid of? What did you understand? He smiled and said. Then that sword stretched forward a few inches. The blade flashed with cold light. This time it was aimed at Lu Chen's throat. As long as he thrust forward, Lu Chen would die here and now. Lu Chen, on the other hand, had a calm expression on his face. He looked at Yi with a smile and asked, "How is your younger brother now?" Yi's body suddenly shook. His eyes suddenly burst with light. But at this moment when he was distracted, he suddenly saw Lu Chen raise his palm slightly. A strange black fog suddenly floated up. Yi's eyes were suddenly filled with darkness. There was no longer any light. Chapter 276. Nowadays, the evil sect, which was regarded as a scourge by the world, was actually called the Holy Sect of the Three Realms. Some of the smaller sects did not know much about the history of their ancestors and mistakenly called it the Holy Sect of the Three Realms. According to the ancient books and textual research passed down by the evil sect, the so-called three realms corresponded to heaven, earth, and man, referring to the three realms of immortal, man, and ghost. But what was the truth and whether there was any basis for this statement, there were different opinions. The people of the evil sect firmly believed in this and took it as their highest goal to welcome the true God to descend to the world and unify the three realms. But the people of the righteous often scoffed at this because in history, other than those illusory ancient myths, there had never been any evidence to prove the existence of the immortal realm and ghost realm. And in order to break the boundaries and invite the true God, the followers of the holy sect of the three realms often indulged in all kinds of unimaginable and exaggerated actions that crossed the boundaries. Moving mountains and filling the seas were all small matters, and there were many cases of people being plunged into misery and suffering. This was what the people of the righteous couldn't tolerate. Even if they didn't talk about the principles of enforcing justice on behalf of heaven, if your sect messed around and caused the world to be in chaos, causing mountains to collapse and the earth to crack and causing heavy casualties, then how could the people of the righteous live? So, the world rose up and attacked them. The holy sect of the three realms was also a powerful sect. If there was a disagreement, they would start fighting. Even if they were to become enemies with the whole world, they wouldn't even bat an eye. Perhaps in the hearts of those fanatical believers, this was also the training of the true God? But faith was faith. No matter how fanatical and powerful you were, you definitely couldn't beat everyone in the world who was angry and resentful. So the result of the continuous war was that the holy sect became the evil sect and became a street rat that everyone wanted to beat up. In order to survive, the evil sect had to keep up with the times and kept a low profile for many years. Then there were many evil and crooked things. Then, following the long and seemingly endless battle with the righteous, these strange and evil techniques became more and more powerful. When Lu Chen was in the evil sect, because of his noble and important status, he knew a lot of secrets and learned a lot of such sinister and evil skills. In fact, he had occasionally wondered if he was really born to do bad things. Otherwise, how could he learn all these crooked things so easily? For example, many years later today, the ink sand he used on He was one of the most sinister methods of the devil cult. The black mist had appeared out of nowhere with a menacing momentum, instantly blocking He's path. He was shocked and instinctively took a step back, But he immediately came to his senses. With an angry roar, he stabbed forward with his sword, wanting to stab Lu Chen to death, who had suddenly launched a sneak attack. However, the sword missed. Presumably, after creating the black fog, Lu Chen directly flipped over and left. He was just about to make a move to leave the black fog and see where Lu Chen was. But suddenly, his eyes felt a sudden pain and tears involuntarily flowed down. At the same time, his eyes seemed to be stabbed by a knife. For a moment, he was in unbearable pain. He was shocked. His heart was shaken. The eyes were an important part of the body and extremely weak. Even if Jean Dan Friar had tempered his body, the eyes were also one of the weakest parts. He did not dare to hesitate and retreated a few steps. At the same time, he closed his eyes and shook his left sleeve to disperse the fog. The spiritual sword in his right hand swept in front of him, guarding against Lu Chen's sneak attack. But he obviously thought too much. Lu Chen did not have the intention to hit him when he was down. A series of low growls were heard. He hugged Atsu and one man and one dog immediately fled. He cursed and retreated a few steps back. At this moment, there was no more black fog around his eyes. He immediately sat down and circulated his power to expel the poison. After all, he was the powerful Jean Dan Friar. He's body was already far stronger than ordinary people. The black fog's poisonous gas could not cause too much harm to him. In fact, this was only an insidious little trick of the evil sect. It might be effective against ordinary cultivators, but against experts above the level of Jean Dan, it could only be used to disgust them. After about half a moment, he jumped up. But on his originally handsome face, there were more than a dozen black spots around his eyes. He looked really scary. He was caught off guard and actually fell for such a sinister little trick. It really made him unable to restrain his anger. He let out an angry roar that soared into the sky. He was unwilling to let the matter rest and directly chased into the distance. That night, he caught up with Lu Chen several times. But every time, Lu Chen would use some kind of more insidious tricks and spells. Some of them were really unimaginable and made he suffer a few times. But he soon discovered that these seemingly frightening and insidious tricks actually had limited effect on him. Under the protection of the powerful Jean Dan realm's spiritual power, he only suffered some flesh wounds at most. But even so, as the number of times he suffered losses increased, he also became angrier. He hated Lu Chen more and more, and his attacks became fiercer and fiercer. However, every time when he caught up with Lu Chen, he would restrain himself from killing him in the middle of each fight. Because he wanted to capture this evil cult spy with an unusually mysterious background and interrogate him properly to find out what secrets he had and what relationship he had with true Lord Tianlan. And most importantly, why did he suddenly mention He Gang? Could it be that his brother's death had something to do with this person? Thinking of this, he felt as if his internal organs were on fire and his eyes were about to spit fire. Lu Chen and Atsu fled with all their might. But they were seriously injured, and Yi was a man with a solid foundation. The distance between them was getting shorter and shorter, and Lu Chen's escape methods were almost exhausted. Then, at a certain moment, they and Yi, who was chasing closely behind, suddenly heard a deep and vigorous sound of water. It was as if a giant dragon was roaring in front of them, striding across the vast wilderness of the chaotic land. Dragon River. Dragon River. The boundary river that separated the dangerous and unpredictable central region of the chaotic land from the outer region. After struggling for a long time, Lu Chen, who was exhausted, could only helplessly lie on Atsu's back and let it charge forward. Speaking of which, Atsu's endurance and speed were on full display during this escape. It was terrifying to the point that it did not seem tired at all. The only reason why Lu Chen was able to survive until now, other than those little tricks that were becoming less effective, was because of Atsu. But at this moment, when the sound of water grew louder and louder, Atsu suddenly stomped on the ground and stopped in its tracks. Its momentum was so strong that it almost threw Lu Chen off its back. Lu Chen raised his head tiredly and his expression changed slightly. He didn't know when, but they had actually run to the top of a cliff. Below their feet was a precipice that was several hundred feet high, and below them was the Dragon Creek River. They had escaped into a hopeless situation. Just as Atsu was about to turn around, they heard a long laugh. A figure descended from the sky and blocked their only way out. It was He, whose eyes were filled with strange black dots. He stood in front of them with a sword in his hand and looked at them with a murderous look. Chapter 277. The Dragon River was a large river. It could even be said to be the largest river in the chaotic lands. The river was so wide that one couldn't see the end of it, almost like the ocean. At the same time, it was also the most famous river in the chaotic lands, because it was the dividing line between the central and outer regions of the chaotic lands. The Dragon River was also an extremely dangerous river. Within the wide river hid countless unimaginable, ferocious and powerful monsters, forming a natural dividing line. Other than the Yuanying realm cultivators of the human race, Jean Dan Friar would often find it difficult to cross this river. Once he crossed the Dragon River and continued south, the dangers in the central region of the chaotic lands would only increase. With Jean Dan Friar's cultivation level, even if he didn't die, he would at least lose more than he would gain. As for those below the Jean Dan realm, they would immediately give up. Over time, the Dragon Creek River became the publicly recognized dividing line and became one of the most dangerous places in the Land of Chaos. However, nothing was absolute. Although the Dragon River was dangerous, it wasn't completely impossible to cross. For example, the barbarians in the chaotic lands had tried to cross the Dragon River. The evil sect had been suppressed by the righteous Tao for many years and had to hide. There were also many people in the chaotic lands. After a long time, they learned some secrets, including how to cross the Dragon River. Although the method was a little dangerous, it was indeed a method. Lu Chen was aware of this in his heart. However, this method was definitely not to fall from this cliff that was several hundred feet high. There were basically two consequences for doing so: falling to death or falling half to death, and then being eaten by the monster beasts in the river. Therefore, Lu Chen was really in a desperate situation now. He had no way out and was at the end of his rope. He held his sword and pointed it at Lu Chen. His eyes were cold as he stared fixedly at Lu Chen and asked coldly, "Who are you? How do you know my brother?" Lu Chen clutched his chest and coughed. At the same time, a deep roar came from beside him. Atsu was standing beside him, glaring angrily at Hei, revealing a pair of sharp fangs. Hei's eyes swept across Atsu, his expression unchanging, as if he didn't see Atsu as a threat. He only stared at Lu Chen with a murderous look in his eyes and said coldly, "Speak. Otherwise, I will make you regret being born into this world." Lu Chen placed his left hand on Atsu's back and coughed again. Atsu turned to look at him, his eyes filled with concern. Lu Chen shook his head slightly and patted his chest as if he was in pain due to the injury. Atsu was stunned for a moment, and his eyes stayed on Lu Chen's palm for a moment. Then, Lu Chen looked up at He and said, "I know him, but I didn't have much contact with him in Kunlun Mountain." He frowned and his eyes softened a little, but he was still a little alert. He sneered and said, "Then why did you mention him?" "To run for my life." Lu Chen said without hesitation, "As long as I can distract you for a moment, that's enough." He was silent. He looked at Lu Chen with a murderous look in his eyes, but he thought of the day his brother died. He saw the bloody handwriting under his brother's badly mutilated body. That dark red word was like a needle, a thorn, instantly piercing Hei's heart, reminding him of that morning when he saw his only family member, his only brother, die in that courtyard. The dead could not be resurrected. Death meant eternal separation. No matter how many regrets there were, they could not make up for it. He felt that he owed his brother, He Gang, a lot. He should have taken good care of him and made him a talent. He had been obsessed with the path of immortality all his life and had no distracting thoughts. He only hoped that He Gang could marry a wife or find a Taoist companion in the future so that the He family could continue its lineage. However, all of this eventually turned into smoke and dissipated. He thought silently, but raised the long sword in his hand. With a hint of a sneer, he stretched it towards Lu Chen and said, "What other tricks do you have? Just use them." Lu Chen did not move. He only smiled bitterly and said, "Forget it, I'll take it as you've won." He sneered, but a hint of smugness flashed across his eyes. This was not because he had finally defeated Lu Chen, but because he thought of the extremely powerful perfected lord of the divine transformation realm in the Kunlun mountain thousands of miles away. If he could bring this person's head back to the Kunlun mountain and present it to perfected Lord Tianlan, he would definitely be extremely happy. A perfected lord's disciple, a Taoist title with the Tian character. Just thinking about these things was enough to make He Yi's blood boil, and he yearned for them endlessly. Therefore, he decided not to delay any further. He looked at Lu Chen coldly and said, "I'll ask you one last time. Who exactly are you, and what's your relationship with perfected Lord Tianlan?" "What's my relationship with that damn baldy?" Lu Chen grimaced and said with some pain, then he took a step back and said, "But I'm also very curious. Why don't you care about the others, and only target an insignificant person like me?" He Yi's face darkened and he said, "I'm the one asking you, not the other way around." Before he finished speaking, he suddenly saw Lu Chen raise one of his palms again from the corner of his eye, and a familiar black gas surged out again. He immediately flipped and retreated a few feet as if it was a conditioned reflex. At the same time, he sneered and said, "Insignificant tricks. Do you still want to harm me again?" This time, his voice suddenly came to a screeching halt. The reason was that Lu Chen had suddenly used a movement to force him back, but he didn't use any sinister methods like ink sand. Instead, he just silently turned around, and then rushed out with large strides. There was a cliff ahead. Behind him, He Yi's expression suddenly changed. With a roar, he rushed forward and reached out to grab Lu Chen's back at the same time. However, Lu Chen had used all his strength in this movement, and his speed was extremely fast. Just a moment before He Yi's palm could grab him, Lu Chen had abruptly jumped off the cliff that was several hundred meters high. The wind was piercingly cold and the waves were wild. The huge dragon river was just below him, and it was getting closer and closer at a rapid speed. Everything seemed to be coming to an end. He Yi, who was standing on the cliff, was shocked. Suddenly, a gust of wind rose beside him. It was the huge black wolf that had directly rushed out of the cliff and fell in the direction where Lu Chen had fallen. In mid-air, Atsu quickly caught up with Lu Chen. Lu Chen gritted his teeth and suddenly turned around to hug Atsu. After a while, their bodies became smaller and smaller, turning into a black dot that was almost invisible. In the end, with a loud bang, they fell directly into the most dangerous river in the land of chaos, the Dragon River, creating a huge splash. On the cliff, he was stunned, sword in hand. His face was blank and puzzled, but after a while, he snorted and turned around to walk back. Chapter 278. The water of the Longchuan was very, very cold. The water of the Longchuan was very, very deep. As soon as they fell into the water, because the cliff was too high, the force of the fall was too great, and they immediately rushed into the depths of the river. Intense sounds of bubbles and gurgling suddenly rang out, and the cold water pressed against them from all directions. At that moment, there was only a dazzling white in front of them. Apart from the water splashes and bubbles, they could see nothing else. But Lu Chen's hand was still tightly holding onto Atsu, holding onto this companion who would not leave him even in the face of death. After rushing down the river for an unknown distance, as the buoyancy of the water increased, the momentum quickly decreased, and Lu Chen and Atsu's bodies finally slowed down. But then, a powerful undercurrent suddenly rolled up in the depths of the river, directly wrapping their bodies together and rushing forward. Lu Chen and Atsu's bodies were involuntarily drifting with the current. In fact, jumping from such a high place into the water, the recoil force was also terrifying. Atsu's body was in a better state, and its body was extraordinarily tough. But the impact that Lu Chen received was even more severe. He was dizzy, his chest was stuffy, and he was seeing stars. He almost fainted again. Fortunately, he was tough and strong, and he knew that this was a matter of life and death, and he must not lose his mind, so he tried his best to stay awake. But in the depths of such a terrible river, being wrapped by countless undercurrents, the power was so strong that he could not do much. At this moment, suddenly, Atsu, who was hugging Lu Chen's body tightly, suddenly raised its head, and its eyes were filled with fear, as if it was suddenly nervous and excited. Lu Chen immediately felt that Atsu's body was strange, because almost all of its muscles seemed to have tightened in an instant. A gigantic shadow appeared from the depths of the Dragon River and began to rapidly approach them. Before the shadow could even reach them, the water current from that direction was like a raging tide, causing Lu Chen and Atsu to tumble a few times in the water. The sound of rolling and crashing water began to ring out fiercely, and the whole underwater world began to churn crazily. Suddenly, a large school of arm-sized fish rushed over from another direction, and the sharp teeth in the water were like incomparably sharp blades, rushing towards the flesh and blood in the water. More shadows appeared, wave after wave, wave after wave. The whole calm Longchuan River seemed to be boiling, and countless terrible creatures swarmed over. They were bloodthirsty, crazy, and ferocious. Even before they rushed over, some of the ferocious creatures directly pounced on them. The big fish ate the small fish, and the monsters killed the big fish. Blood flowed and dyed the river red. Above their heads, below their feet, in all directions, under this terrible and deep river, countless ferocious creatures looked around, and there was only despair left. Lu Chen did not hesitate anymore. He hugged Atsu tightly with one hand and pressed his other hand on his chest. The huge shadow behind him and under his feet had already rushed forward, and suddenly rose up. The whole Longchuan River suddenly rose by 10 feet. A wave of spiritual power flashed, and time seemed to freeze for a moment in the depths of the river. Then, Lu Chen and Atsu's bodies suddenly disappeared, and the little gap was immediately flooded by the river. The shadow fell down and crushed everything. All the monster fish instantly scattered, but where the shadow passed, a large number of creatures were directly pulled back by the surging tide, and then disappeared into the depths of the shadow. Blood flowed and floated in the river, and then quickly thinned and disappeared. Everything became quiet again, and everything returned to its original state. Only a tiny seed silently appeared in this vast, ocean-like river. It was circled by a wave, knocked away by a passing monster, staggered, and floated down. Suddenly, it was seen by a swimming big fish and swallowed. After a moment, it seemed that the seed was too hard. The big fish shook its body, tilted its head, and spat it out again. Then, it swam away leisurely. A string of bubbles rose from the water, and the seed rolled a few times. Then, it was gradually taken away in the water, and disappeared into the depths. On Mount Kunlun, in the side hall behind the Jianghu Hall of Tiankuan Peak, this was originally a place for the Yuanying stage spiritual masters to meet and discuss matters. Now, it had been temporarily used by perfected Lord Tianlan as a place to meet guests. Of course, with perfected Tianlan's current status, as well as his supreme prestige in the Kunlun sect, no one would say anything about it, not even the acting sect master Qiandeng, who now had great power. As time passed, it was getting longer and longer until the night of the intense changes of the full moon. The situation in the Kunlun party also became clearer and more stable. It seemed that everyone had accepted the current situation. In any case, they couldn't fight against the sect master, so they just accepted it. Otherwise, who would be dissatisfied and shout a few words at the deity transformation stage spiritual master? However, perfected Lord Tianlan usually didn't care too much about the chores in the sect. Most of the time, he let Qiandeng handle things. Most of the time, he was elusive, and it was rare to see him. However, on this day, he appeared behind the Jianghu Hall and met a few people in the side hall. Zhuxian brought White Lotus and stood in front of the deity transformation stage spiritual master. Perfected Lord Tianlan looked down and sized up the little girl who looked to be in her early teens. At this moment, White Lotus seemed to be a little nervous. Her face was slightly pale, and she didn't dare to look directly at perfected Lord Tianlan. She just silently looked at the ground in front of her. After a long time, she didn't say a word and just stood there motionlessly. Perfected Lord Tianlan didn't get angry, but there was a strange look in his eyes. It couldn't be said to be angry, but it seemed to be a more complicated expression. He looked at the little girl and seemed to be thinking about something. After a while, the situation still didn't change. Zhuxian, who was standing at the side, couldn't stand it anymore. He coughed lightly and whispered to White Lotus, "Quickly greet Uncle Master." White Lotus's lips moved, and for the first time, she raised her head to look at Supreme Tianlun. She saw a bald, fat man. Her lips moved a few times, and then she silently knelt down and kowtowed 3 times on the ground. Perfected Lord Tianlun revealed a faint smile and said, "Why are you kneeling in front of me?" White Lotus lowered her head and knelt on the ground. After a while, she said, "Uncle Master, please spare my life." Perfected Lord Tianlun laughed and said, "You're really a smart child. No wonder I heard that my senior brother liked you the most in his later years. Come, tell me, what does senior brother usually say about me?" White Lotus said, "Do you want to hear the truth or a lie?" Perfected Lord Tianlun smiled and said, "Of course the truth." White Lotus said with an "oh," and said, "When Master was still alive, he told me, second senior brother, and eldest senior brother, that although you're talented and bold, you're too ambitious and want too much. We can't allow you to control the power of Kunlun. Otherwise, the orthodoxy of our Kunlun party that has been passed down for 5,000 years will be destroyed." The side hall instantly fell silent. Zhuxian, who was standing at the side, suddenly turned abnormally pale. Chapter 279. Perfected Lord Tianlun was silent. His eyes flickered slightly as he stared at White Lotus. The hall was silent. If he didn't speak, no one dared to say a word. No one knew what he was thinking at the moment and whether he would be enraged or angry. If he was enraged, the hall would probably be filled with dead people. The atmosphere seemed to freeze and time seemed to stop as well. After an unknown period of time, Perfected Lord Tianlun suddenly stood up and walked down from his seat. He walked to White Lotus and stared at her for a moment before saying indifferently, "You're quite bold at such a young age. Did my senior brother teach you all this as well?" His fat body just stood there casually. He did not look ferocious, nor did he give off an oppressive aura. However, there was a majestic aura that made White Lotus speechless. After waiting for a moment, Perfected Lord Tianlun turned to look at Zhuxian and said, "What about you? Have you heard senior brother Bai Chen say these words before?" Under the bright and somewhat dazzling gaze of this soul formation perfected lord, Zhuxian's legs also turned to jelly. He laughed dryly and sweat appeared on his forehead. After hesitating for a moment, he still said softly, "Junior sister didn't lie. I've indeed heard Master say this once before." With his hands behind his back, Perfected Lord Tianlun slowly walked to the window at the side and raised his hand to look at the sky. His expression was indifferent and no one could tell what changes were going on in his heart. After a while, he said slowly, "Senior brother and I have known each other for a lifetime, but he never understood my feelings. It really makes me feel regretful. We're brothers. If we meet again in the netherworld in the future, I'll naturally tell him my feelings. Get up." The last sentence was said to White Lotus, who was still kneeling on the ground. White Lotus responded softly and stood up to walk to Zhuxian's side, standing there quietly. Perfected Lord Tianlun swept his gaze across the two of them and said a moment later, "White Lotus." White Lotus did not reply and stood with her head lowered. Zhuxian, who was at the side, sighed and lightly touched White Lotus. White Lotus then said in a low voice, "Your disciple is here." Perfected Lord Tianlun said indifferently, "Senior brother has unfortunately passed away, leaving behind 3 disciples. As their martial uncle, I can't just sit by and do nothing. Your eldest senior brother and second senior brother have already been settled. You're the only one left." At this point, White Lotus suddenly raised her head and glanced at Zhuxian beside her. Zhuxian's expression was calm and collected, as if he was indifferent to this. After a while, White Lotus slowly lowered her head again. "You're the only one who hasn't settled down. Speaking of which, your aptitude is extremely high and you're a rare talent of the 5 pillars. If you can cultivate in peace, you'll definitely bring glory to our Kunlun lineage in the future. However, given the current situation, I think you have 2 paths in front of you." The corners of White Lotus's mouth twitched slightly and a hint of anger flashed across the depths of her eyes. However, she still clenched her teeth and did not say anything. Perfected Lord Tianlan didn't seem to notice the slight change in her expression. He just said calmly, "First of all, I also feel pity for your outstanding talent. If you're willing, you can temporarily join me as an in-name disciple and cultivate first. If you're successful in the future, you can also formally acknowledge me as your master." Bai Lian was stunned for a moment, as if she was surprised by that. However, her face turned pale very quickly because Perfected Lord Tianlan's voice sounded again. "It's just that the Dermic Tao that I've learned is very different from Senior Brother Bai Chen's and it's incompatible. If you want to become my disciple, you'll have to abolish all the superficial techniques that you've learned previously." Zhuo Xian, who was standing to the side, also had a slight change in expression. A trace of pity flashed across his eyes, but he quickly hid this little bit of pity. White Lotus stood on the spot and asked softly after a while, "May I ask if there's a second path, Uncle Master?" Perfected Lord Tianlan nodded. "There is. Secondly, that senior brother of mine has already passed away. However, he was once a peerless and peerless perfected lord who looked down on the world. How can such an outstanding person end up in a situation where no one cares about him even after his death? The rock mountain where Winter Peak crashed is Senior Brother Bai Chen's tomb. Since you're free now, go and keep watch for him. It won't be too late to come and find me when you've thought it through." White Lotus's body trembled slightly. She raised her head and wanted to say something, but she held back and turned to look at Zhuo Xian. Zhuo Xian nodded. "How about this, Uncle Master? Little junior sister has just returned to the mountain after all and is still unaware of some things. Furthermore, she's still young and insensible, so please give her a few more days. I'll send her to stay at the rock mountain first. Firstly, it'll be to keep watch for Master, and secondly, it'll be to enlighten her. Is that all right?" Perfected Lord Tianlan replied, "Sure." Zhuo Xian bowed deeply to him, then left with White Lotus. White Lotus seemed a little disappointed, but she still followed him obediently in the end. Just as they left, another person happened to walk in as well. It was he. Zhuo Xian and he exchanged glances and nodded slightly before brushing past each other a moment later. Disciple He greets Perfected Lord. When there were only the two of them left in the hall, he walked to the back of Perfected Lord Tianlan, bowed respectfully, and spoke first. Perfected Lord Tianlan glanced at him indifferently before returning to the main seat and sitting down. "You're back. How was your trip to the land of chaos?" He cupped his fists and said with a smile, "I'm glad that I didn't disappoint you. I've specially come to report the good news to you." Perfected Lord Tianlan looked at him quietly. For some reason, the gentleness that had always been on his face suddenly disappeared as he merely nodded. "Oh, tell me about it. What's the good news?" Disciple entered deep into the chaotic land and pursued for thousands of miles. Finally, at the Dragon River, I blocked the evil cult spy and killed him with my own hands. His corpse fell into the Dragon River. It can be said that he died without a burial place. Perfected Lord Tianlan's pupils constricted slightly as he asked in a deep voice, "You killed that person?" "That's right." He Yi's expression was awe-inspiring, his demeanor unafraid. He said in a clear voice, "These evil people of the devil cult have committed all kinds of evil, bringing disaster to the people of the righteous path of the world. As a disciple of Kunlun sect, it is my duty to enforce justice on behalf of heaven, to eliminate evil and promote good." Perfected Lord Tianlan did not say anything and merely looked at Yi quietly. Being stared at by him, he felt a little excited in his heart. He took another step forward and said, "Disciple's trip this time is also to prove to you that Disciple is talented enough to take you as a disciple. I will definitely not disappoint you. Even that Tian Daoist name, Disciple, has the confidence to bring glory to you. You want to be my disciple after killing that person and even want the Tian Dao title?" Perfected Lord Tianlan stood up slowly and stared at him. His expression gradually turned complicated as though a strange emotion was lingering in his heart. A faint but intense heartbeat rumbled in a certain quiet corner. "Yes, please grant my wish, Perfected Lord." He knelt on the ground. Perfected Lord Tianlan stood at a high place and looked down at that person. His eyes seemed to be filled with wind, clouds, and lightning. Chapter 280. The black tail moved on the ground, and a small piece of the tail was missing. The wound was smooth and neat, and it looked like it was cut by a sharp blade. After a while, the black tail curled up and hid under its body. Then Atsu's ears suddenly pricked up, and its body, which was originally curled up on the ground, suddenly stood up, as if it was suddenly awakened from its sleep. It looked around in a trance and fear. The mottled old tree wall appeared in front of its eyes, and it could vaguely see the outline of the two opposite doors. On the ground not far away, there was a familiar-looking puddle. The water in the puddle was clear and transparent, and occasionally there would be a string of bubbles. Don't be so suspicious. This is a tree hole. There won't be a whole river of Longchuan suddenly pouring down from above us. A somewhat lazy voice came from the other side of the puddle. Atsu looked up and saw Lu Chen sitting with his back against the tree wall. He was frowning and changing the medicine on his wounds. Occasionally, he would grimace and say to Atsu, "Stupid dog, come and help me." Atsu jumped up and trotted to Lu Chen's side. It then used its teeth to bite the cloth that Lu Chen handed over to it. After Lu Chen applied medicine to the wound, with Atsu's help, the wound was safely and neatly bandaged up. At this moment, Lu Chen's complexion looked much better than before. His face was no longer pale, and there was a little redder. After he moved his arms and body, he nodded with satisfaction and said, "It should be fine in another 5 or 6 days." Atsu barked twice. Lu Chen looked at it and said with a smile, "How is it? Now you know how powerful I am? I have stored a lot of food, medicine, and all kinds of clothes in this tree hole. What do you call this?" This is what you call foresight." Atsu's ears drooped, and he looked very happy. He even rubbed his head against Lu Chen's body. Lu Chen smiled and pushed its head away, then stood up and walked to one side of the tree hole. There was a large pile of things there which looked like a hill. Lu Chen rummaged in it for a while, then took out 2 pieces of dried meat and threw them directly to Atsu. Atsu bit it and immediately began to chew. Lu Chen looked at Atsu and shook his head with a smile. Although he looked relaxed, there was still a trace of worry in his eyes. As early as when he was on the mountain of Kunlun, he had more or less a hunch in his heart. In order to be safe, he secretly prepared these things in this tree hole in secret. As a result, it really came in handy at the critical moment. However, even though he had considered all the details and had even included Atsu's portion, he had not expected that Atsu, this stupid dog, would have a huge appetite to begin with. After he had advanced to become a holy beast, this fellow's appetite seemed to have increased by more than 1-fold. Lu Chen found it hard to imagine how this big black dog could eat so much. However, when he thought about it carefully, there were actually some clues to the reason behind it. When they met again after the night of the full moon, Atsu almost no longer ate ordinary food. Its favorite food was the flesh of monsters full of vitality, and the fresher it was, the more it liked it. However, of course, there was no such condition in this tree hole, so after starving for a while, this stupid dog quickly lost the moral integrity of a holy beast. No matter what it was, as long as it could eat, it would eat with relish. However, the price of this was that its appetite was shockingly huge, and the food it had was rapidly decreasing. Besides that, there was another problem in front of Lu Chen that gave him a headache, and that was how to get out. In the past, when Lu Chen had this mysterious seed, he was extremely careful every time he went in and out of this mysterious tree hole. Not only did he have to choose an extremely secluded place, but he also chose to enter in the dead of night, so as to minimize all possible external interference. This was because it was extremely dangerous to go out after entering this tree hole. It was impossible to detect any changes in the outside world, and if someone were to ambush him, it would be extremely dangerous. It was precisely because of this that Lu Chen did not use the seed even though he had encountered a few dangerous moments along the way. It was only after he fell into the Longchuan River that he was forced to hide with Atsu because the river water blocked his line of sight from the shore and there were many monsters swarming towards him from the river. It was really a matter of life and death. Lu Chen had no choice but to hide in the river with Atsu. However, it was easy to come in, but it was very dangerous to go out. At this time, Lu Chen basically knew nothing about the situation outside of the seed. The seed was currently in the depths of the Longchuan River. The moment it went out, it would immediately be crushed to death by the huge waves. Even if it was not crushed to death, the countless monsters in the river, as long as the seed fell near them, it would basically die. Another example was that the Longchuan River was very long, but no one knew where the river flowed to. They only knew that the river would eventually turn into the depths of the disorienting lands. In other words, when they went out, even if the seed was not in the Longchuan River, it was very likely to be in the more dangerous central region. Once they went out, they might open their eyes and see a monster the size of a mountain slapping them. In short, if they had no other choice but to hide in the tree hole, the situation would be really troublesome when they went out. Lu Chen thought about this for a long time, but ultimately could not come up with a good idea. In the end, he could only put these thoughts aside. This mysterious and ancient tree hole was isolated from the rest of the world. There were two clearly defined doors embedded in the tree wall, but they couldn't be opened at all. Instead, they had to rely on the spiritual connection between Lu Chen and the seed to get in and out of here. However, it was strange. Although there was no airflow or wind in this tree hole, it was not stuffy at all. Also, there was a puddle on the ground of the tree hole. These days, whether it was Lu Chen or Atsu, they had been drinking water from it, but the clear water in the puddle did not subside at all. It looked like this small world was self-contained. If there was enough food, and if one was not afraid of being lonely all year round, one could really live in this place for a long time. However, the food that Lu Chen brought seemed to be a little tight, and he himself felt that if he stayed in this tree hole for too long, he would most likely go crazy. Therefore, he had to leave this place sooner or later. Yes, he had to leave before he starved to death. Lu Chen thought so in his heart, then he walked to the edge of the puddle and squatted down. Atsu buried its head in eating the meat that was destined to not be full. It looked up at Lu Chen and thought for a moment. A dog paw stretched forward, but it pushed a piece of meat in front of Lu Chen. Lu Chen looked down and laughed. He reached out and touched Atsu's head. He smiled and said, "I'm not hungry, you can eat it yourself." Atsu obediently scooped up the piece of meat and looked very happy as he continued to tear it apart. Lu Chen looked at the water. A long time ago, when he came here for the first time, the water was not so transparent. At that time, the entire puddle was filled with unimaginably abundant life essence, and even the color of the water was light green. But now, things had naturally changed. At this moment, the water was clear and transparent, and it could be seen at a glance. When Lu Chen looked over, he could still see the strange cluster of black fire at the bottom of the puddle, burning silently in the water. At the same time, not far from the black fire, there was a spirit herb about the thickness of a baby's arm, white and tender in color, and shaped like a lotus root. It was one of the spirit herbs that Atsu stole from the Kunlun party's fragrance garden during the big earthquake in Kunlun Mountain. It was called black mud lotus. On that day, Lu Chen hid those spirit herbs in this tree hole, and the other spirit herbs were placed on the ground. Only this black mud lotus could not survive without water, so it was thrown into this puddle that day. After that, things happened one after another, and there was almost no time to breathe. Lu Chen almost never came here again, so he had long forgotten about this matter. But at this moment, when he looked at this black mud lotus again, Lu Chen suddenly frowned slightly. He felt that there was something strange. It was just separated by a layer of water, but the black mud lotus under the water was somewhat blurry and could not be seen clearly. After he pondered for a moment, he rolled up his sleeves and knelt by the water. Then he slowly reached his hand into the water and grabbed the black mud lotus. Atsu, who was eating at the side, also seemed to feel something. After looking over, he also stood up, rolled up his tongue, and walked over to look into the water. This originally quiet tree hole, at this moment, suddenly seemed to be even more silent. There was not even the slightest sound. Only when Lu Chen's hand reached in, the water splashed, and the bubbles rose, making a little crashing sound. The misty green gas slowly flowed on the tree wall, twining in the gaps of the ancient bark. There were also the two doors that had been silent for a long time, as if they were silently staring at the human below. That hand reached into the water and grabbed downwards. The water rippled and slid, and then a string of bubbles of different sizes rose up. For some reason, the bubbles appeared particularly bright and lustrous. In every spherical bubble, there was a reflection, which was Lu Chen's face. As if thousands of illusions of the world were gathered here. Lu Chen's hand paused for a moment. He stared at these bubbles, and after a moment he continued to reach downwards. This piece of water began to shake, as if there was a very slight wave, slowly surging. But after a moment, Lu Chen's hand finally touched the surface of the black mud lotus. There was a slippery feeling to the touch, as if it was no different from the feeling when he first obtained this spirit herb. Lu Chen's heart let out a sigh of relief. He raised his arm, and when he was about to stand up with it, suddenly his body stiffened. The black mud lotus swayed a few times in the water, and the water swayed even more violently, but this spirit herb did not leave the water. Lu Chen coldly looked through the water, and saw that one end of the black mud lotus had unknowingly pierced into the soil under the water, as if it had already taken root. And on the other side, the black fire, not far away, also slowly swayed a few times. Chapter 281. Lu Chen's brows furrowed, and he was a little startled for a moment. He had experienced many twists and turns in the past, so he knew quite a lot about many kinds of complex spirit herbs. However, he probably only knew how to identify their shapes, appearances, and uses. Naturally, he would not carefully remember more. He knew about the black mud lotus, but after thinking for a long time, he couldn't remember if this spirit herb would take root and germinate by itself once it was placed in water. After pondering for a moment, he tried to pull it up again. Who knew that this black mud lotus seemed to have taken root very firmly? Even with his strength, he couldn't move it. Following Lu Chen's movement, the surrounding water seemed to be shaking more and more violently. A string of bubbles kept floating up, and at the same time, there was a gurgling sound of water. This sound echoed in this unusually quiet and mysterious tree hole. It seemed a bit abrupt, and for some reason, there seemed to be some echoes. Atu suddenly raised his head, his eyes looking up, and then he let out a low roar. Lu Chen's arm that was grabbing the black mud lotus paused for a moment. He looked back at us. After a moment, he let go of the black mud lotus and slowly stood up. In such a big tree hole, the echo seemed insignificant and was slowly disappearing. The water around him also slowly calmed down, and everything quickly returned to its original state. Lu Chen didn't do anything else. He just frowned and looked at the surrounding ancient tree walls. His eyes seemed to have a thoughtful look. There was no day or night in the cave, and he didn't know the rotation of the sun and moon. Lu Chen could only rely on the speed of his own recovery to roughly judge the passage of time. When the wounds on his body were basically healed, Lu Chen also discovered that the food he stored in this tree hole was almost used up. That stupid dog, known as the Holy Beast, really ate too much. It seemed that no matter what, he had to go and gamble. He hoped that his luck would be good enough when he went out. If possible, with Lu Chen's temperament, he actually didn't want to gamble this time. However, he had already explored every inch of this mysterious ancient tree hole for so many years, and there was no other way out. He stood up and walked to the side of the tree hole. The items that were originally piled up like a small hill were now only a thin layer. Lu Chen's eyes swept across and began to squat down to clean up. There were also some spirit herbs and sundries that were placed on one side, and food was placed on the other. At this time, there was movement behind him. It turned out that Atsu had also walked over. Its eyes were shining as it looked at the remaining food, and it had a greedy look. Lu Chen smiled and patted Atsu's head. He didn't seem to be angry at all. He casually pulled a few pieces of dried meat in front of Atsu, and then said, "Eat." Atsu stuck out its tongue and licked its mouth. Just as it lowered its head and was about to eat, it suddenly looked at Lu Chen and seemed to be a little embarrassed. It groaned a few times, then slowly stretched out a front foot and patted Lu Chen's hand. Lu Chen laughed and reached out his hand to hug Atsu's neck. He said, "Eat when you are full, we will leave this place. Let's gamble and rush out, life or death will be up to fate." Atsu barked and seemed to be very happy. Then it lowered its head and began to eat. Lu Chen smiled and looked at Atsu for a while, then turned back and continued to tidy up. But after a while he suddenly saw something lying in a corner of a tree hole. He couldn't help but be startled for a moment, then he reached out and picked it up. This was the half of the fire god's staff that he got from the barbarian tribe. It was the same as when he first got it. This half of the ancient and damaged staff was lifeless, cracked and withered. It looked like it was useless other than using it as firewood to make a stove. But of course, the truth shouldn't be like this. That day in the barbarian tribe, the various strange abilities of this fire god's staff were still clearly remembered by Lu Chen. What was more special was that this fire god's staff could faintly resonate with the strange black fire power in his body. This was the main reason why he disregarded the danger and wanted to get this wooden staff in his hands. But at this moment, the fire god's staff didn't seem to have any spiritual power. No matter how Lu Chen tried to test it these days, there was no reaction. In the end, he could only casually throw it in this corner. After all, in this ancient and mysterious tree hole, no matter how powerful the fire god's staff was, it was not as precious as a bit of food. Holding the fire god's staff and silently stroking it, Lu Chen was silent. Suddenly, his heart moved. He turned his head to look at the puddle behind him, and then walked over with large strides. In the days that he stayed in the tree hole, Lu Chen tried many ways to test the fire god's staff. Of course, he also used the black fire power in his body. But whether it was because the fire god's staff had consumed too much spiritual power, or because the black fire power in Lu Chen's body was not enough, the fire god's staff did not have any reaction. But just now, Lu Chen suddenly thought of another thing. In this ancient tree hole, there was another black fire. It was a cluster of black flames that burned under the puddle, but still did not extinguish in the water. Thinking back to that extremely dangerous scene, Lu Chen desperately dug out the black fire in his body and relied on the water of life to forcibly extend his life. In that process, most of the power of the black flame curse was in the cluster of black flames under the water. Maybe this would be of some use? Lu Chen lowered his head to look at the cluster of black flames in the water. Looking at it now, the black flame was small and quiet. It was impossible to tell how vicious and sinister it had been in the past 10 years. It had almost tortured Lu Chen to the point where he wished he was dead. Lu Chen exhaled softly and calmed his mind. Then he took the fire god's staff and began to reach into the cluster of black flames under the water. The moment the wooden staff entered the water, the clear water wet the wood. Suddenly, 7 small whirlpools appeared in the water around the wooden staff. The water swirled in them, and the water seemed to tremble slightly. Lu Chen's eyes lit up. This kind of phenomenon had never happened before. It seemed that the fire god's staff's reaction in this puddle was indeed somewhat different. He held the fire god's staff and paused in the water for a moment. When he found that there were no more phenomena other than the few whirlpools, he began to try to continue reaching down. The fire god's staff went deeper and deeper in the water, and the surrounding water trembled more and more violently. The water in the whirlpools began to flow faster and faster. The surface of the entire puddle seemed to have faint ripples because of the violent tremors. After another moment, Lu Chen suddenly felt the fire god's staff in his hand tremble violently. A gentle spiritual power was transmitted from the wooden staff and then dissipated. And under the water, the cluster of black flames seemed to feel something. It suddenly swelled a little and began to sway back and forth. The fire god's staff was still descending, getting closer and closer to the black flames. Suddenly, a large number of bubbles of various sizes suddenly floated up. It was unknown how many times more than what Lu Chen had seen before. The transparent outer walls of each bubble reflected all kinds of shadows, but they were not the shadows of Lu Chen. In those bubbles, there was the vault of heaven and earth, all things in the world, all living beings, the passing of time, the destruction of the void, the various states of life, the joys and sorrows of separation and reunion. Thousands of worlds were only in the illusory bubbles. Just like that, they were unguarded in front of Lu Chen's eyes. The body of the fire god's staff began to heat up. The withered old would seem to suddenly be reborn. Lines and lines of spiritual power appeared on the body of the staff, forming mysterious and strange runes that slowly lit up. At the same time, there was a whistling sound in the surrounding water, and the 7 whirlpools suddenly widened several times. The water waves jumped fiercely, and some even jumped out of the water. All the bubbles rushed to the surface of the water as if they were flying, and burst, bringing along the illusory bubbles into nothingness. On the surface of the water, the cluster of black flames violently swayed for a moment. Then, it left the bottom of the water and slowly floated up towards the fire god's staff. The fire god's staff trembled incessantly. It was as if it was extremely excited, welcoming the power that it had long desired. Like a clap of thunder in the silence, like a roar in the underworld, the dark eyes suddenly looked back from the depths of time, passing through the years, reaching the other shore and landing on him. The black flames lit up in Lu Chen's eyes, burning fiercely. At that moment, the black flames in the water finally landed on the fire god's staff. In an instant, all the totem runes on the fire god's staff lit up together. The surrounding water rumbled, and in a moment, it was as if a huge thunder roared. The entire pool of water rushed up 2 feet into the air, and then immediately fell back down. The fire god's staff trembled and whistled. It struggled free from Lu Chen's hands and floated up. It circled in the air a few times, and the black flames ignited from the tip of the fire god's staff. In the blink of an eye, it covered all the totem runes. It looked as if the entire staff was engulfed by the black flames, but it also looked as if the black flames had been reborn, burning fiercely on the ancient staff. A mysterious and vast power seemed to descend from the void, pouring into the fire god's staff. A burst of dazzling light shone, like the sun that could not be looked at directly. Lu Chen covered his eyes with his hands and took a step back. Then, he felt that the light gradually calmed down, and the majestic and terrifying power in the surroundings also gradually calmed down. The fire god's staff in the air gradually calmed down, and the totem runes slowly disappeared. But at this moment, the fire god's staff no longer looked withered. The entire staff looked smooth and tough. In other words, the fire god's staff seemed to be more like a legendary divine treasure. Lu Chen stretched out his hand to catch the fire god's staff. He carefully tested it, and found that there didn't seem to be anything wrong. After a moment of silence, he tried waving it twice, but there was no reaction. Could it be that after making such a big commotion just now, it only became a slightly better-looking wooden staff? Lu Chen scratched his head. After thinking for a moment, he tried to circulate the power of the black flames in his body. Sure enough, there was a reaction. The totem on the fire god's staff quickly lit up, but it seemed that it was just like that. When the power of the black flames stimulated it, the fire god's staff also lit up at the same time. Other than that, there was no other strange phenomenon. There was neither the power to destroy heaven and earth, nor the means to kill the enemy. Lu Chen tried for a while, but it was still the same. In the end, he could only sigh, shrug his shoulders, and put it aside. Then, he turned to look at Atsu and said, "Are you full? Let's go out." Chapter 282. Most of the things could be placed in this tree hole. Anyway, the seed was in Lu Chen's chest, so it was easy to take it out. However, some self-defense items had to be carried, such as the black dagger that Lu Chen was most comfortable with. As for Atsu, its sharp fangs were its weapons, so there was no need to prepare anything. When everything was almost ready, Lu Chen threw the last bit of meat to Atsu, then patted its head and said, "Eat more, I don't know what will happen later." Atsu obediently lowered its head and began to eat. Lu Chen sat down to rest, quietly waiting for the fateful moment to arrive. Thinking back to the scene when he just escaped into the tree hole, there was a high possibility that the outside of this seed was still under the incomparably dangerous Dragon River. If that was really the case, with the double threat of the boundless river water and ferocious beasts, it was really a hopeless situation with only a slim chance of survival. However, thinking about this at this moment was useless. He could only use the phrase, "leave it to fate," to mock himself. Anyway, staying in this tree hole would only mean starving to death, so he might as well take a gamble. Lu Chen slightly shook his head, shaking off these thoughts that troubled his mind. His gaze swept across the inside of the tree hole and saw the half of the fire god's staff lying in the corner. After fusing with the cluster of black flames in the puddle, the current fire god's staff could be said to have changed. The surface was obviously much smoother, most of the cracks had also disappeared, and in many places, the faint lines of the totem runes could even be seen. And, as long as Lu Chen held the fire god's staff and activated the power of the black flames, the fire god's staff would shine and brighten. But it was only shining and shining. Other than that, it was useless. Lu Chen had tried many times and many methods, but he could not find the trick to activate the fire god's staff's power. Especially when he was in the barbarian tribe, the strange power of the fire god's staff seemed to have completely disappeared without a trace. It could be said that this fire god's staff was one of the most inexplicable and bizarre magical weapons that Lu Chen had ever seen in his life. However, once he thought that this thing was related to the equally bizarre and ferocious black flame curse, it did not seem strange anymore. Lu Chen held the Vulcan staff in his hand and played with it for a while. After pondering for a while, he put it aside. The origin of this magic treasure was mysterious, and the power it contained was astonishing. However, he didn't know how to use it. If he brought it with him when he went out, it would be very easy for him to accidentally lose it in some dangerous situation. That would not be good. After sitting for a while, Atsu had finished eating all the meat. He licked his lips and walked over with a satisfied look, which was rare for him. Lu Chen stood up and patted Atsu's back. He took a deep breath, smiled at Atsu, and said, "Let's go." That familiar dizziness made him feel as if the world had turned upside down and the world was spinning. Everything in front of him was pitch black. It was as if he had passed through an endless starry sky, or as if he had passed through the deep sea. There was a constant roar in his ears, but he couldn't make out what exactly it was. That moment was supposed to be short, but it seemed strangely long. Lu Chen could even clearly feel his body floating and swaying, as well as the cold feeling coming from his surroundings. He subconsciously curled up his body, like a lonely child facing the dark night in fear. Then, light shone and sprinkled down. Bang! 2 bodies fell heavily to the ground. At the same time, there was a little splash. When Lu Chen woke up, his first reaction was to immediately grasp the black sword tightly and look around. Atsu, who had fallen at the same time beside him, also reacted quickly. It jumped up, bared its teeth, and looked around fiercely. It was daytime. The scorching sun hung in the sky, and the sunlight shone on the earth. There seemed to be a desolate atmosphere floating in the air. They were on the riverbank of a large river. The river water that washed ashore from time to time even wet the bottom of Lu Chen's pants. The river was a large river, and it looked extremely wide. At a glance, it was almost impossible to see the other side. This made Lu Chen subconsciously think of the dragon river that he had fallen into. Could it be that his luck was so good that the seed was actually washed ashore by the river? For a moment, Lu Chen was in a daze. After a while, he gradually came back to his senses and looked around. He saw that the riverbank he was in was filled with rocks, and the area was also very large. The rocks spread far and wide, and in the distance, there seemed to be a wasteland. As far as his eyes could see, he actually didn't see a single tree. It was the same even on this riverbank. Other than the sound of the flowing river, there was no other sound. Lu Chen slightly frowned, and a trace of vigilance flashed across his eyes. Although this land was quiet, it did not look safe. There was something strange about it. There was plenty of water on the riverbank. Logically speaking, there should be a lot of vegetation. However, not even a single blade of grass grew here, let alone any animals or monsters. The land was dead silent, as if there was no life. After a moment of silence, Lu Chen brought Atsu, who was also a little surprised, and walked a few more steps towards the riverbank. After confirming that there was no danger around, he put away the black short sword in his hand and let out a long breath. Although this land still looked a little strange, no matter what, being able to stand on this land safely was already many times better than the terrible situation that he had expected before he came out. Now that he was temporarily safe, the next thing he had to do was to determine where he was. However, This was where Lu Chen ran into trouble. Apart from the fact that he could roughly determine that the river next to him was the Dragon River, Lu Chen had never heard of this desolate land. He did not know how far the seed had been washed away by the river during this period of time. Although the Dragon River was the boundary river in the central region of the Land of Chaos, in reality, the river still flowed into an unknown place in the depths of the Land of Chaos. Lu Chen faintly felt that he was currently somewhere in the central region of the Land of Chaos. After pondering for a while, Lu Chen finally decided to walk around. At the very least, he had to take a look before deciding. Although this place was full of danger, the good thing was that after surviving this calamity, his pursuers probably wouldn't be able to catch up to him for a while. Because the riverbank, or rather, the wasteland behind the rocky beach, looked shockingly vast, almost like a large piece of barren land, Lu Chen didn't dare to rashly enter. Instead, he walked along the direction of the river to see if he could find any clues. However, just as he was about to raise his chi and dash forward, he suddenly let out a muffled groan. His entire face instantly turned pale, and he directly fell to the ground. Atsu, who was standing beside Lu Chen, was shocked. He instinctively jumped away, then hurriedly ran back to Lu Chen and rubbed his head against Lu Chen's body. Lu Chen gasped for breath with an unbearable pain on his face. Beads of sweat seeped out of his forehead. After a while, his painful appearance slowly calmed down and he sat up. His face gradually revealed a trace of disbelief. Just now, when he subconsciously planned to urge the spiritual power in his body to hurry on, all the meridians in his body suddenly twisted together. All of the spiritual power seemed to have instantly gone out of control and crazily crashed into the meridians. That situation was really like being possessed by the devil. Fortunately, after the battle 10 years ago, his body's cultivation was greatly damaged. Today's spiritual power was no longer the same as it was in the past, so the damage caused wasn't too big. If it was any other Foundation establishment or Jindan Friar, it was very likely that they would be in danger of exploding. Lu Chen was really shocked. If he couldn't use spiritual power, he was almost no different from an ordinary person. If a slightly more powerful demonic beast came, he wouldn't have the power to protect himself. This place was completely desolate. It really was an extremely sinister place, dangerous and immeasurable. However, it was also at this time that Lu Chen's heart suddenly moved and he thought of something else. The situation just now was a little similar to the legendary deepest part of the Land of Chaos, where the 5 elemental spiritual power had reached the most chaotic and crazy place. It was said that the 5 elemental spiritual power in the deepest part of the Land of Chaos was chaotic and could not be absorbed at all. Even if one used their own spiritual power, they would immediately be affected by the outside world and suffer a backlash. It was one of the most dangerous places in the world. Lu Chen was stunned for a moment. The 5 elemental spiritual energy was so chaotic. Could it be that he wasn't in the middle of the Land of Chaos, but the most dangerous part of the Land of Chaos? Thinking of this, Lu Chen couldn't help but suck in a breath of cold air. It must be known that the center of the Land of Chaos was a place of natural danger, led by the Chaos Abyss, the spirit-shattering Sand Sea, and other dangerous places. It was a place that even a perfected Yuanian cultivator wouldn't dare to easily set foot in. With his current abilities, he might not be able to get out of this place. After standing in a daze for a moment, Lu Chen quickly calmed down. Since he was already in this situation, he could only take it one step at a time. He turned around and called out to Atsu before continuing forward. However, after taking 2 steps, he suddenly stopped and turned to look at Atsu. He said with some surprise, "Are you all right?" Atsu wagged his tail and skipped a few times beside him, looking rather pleased with himself. "Oh, I'm all right. That's great." Lu Chen smiled and said, "Come over and carry me." With this huge black wolf as a mount, the journey was naturally much longer. As for why this place didn't affect Atsu, it was probably because it was a demonic beast and didn't have any 5 elemental spiritual power. Lu Chen didn't know the reason and couldn't be bothered to think about it. After riding Atsu for half a day, a mountain suddenly appeared in front of him. It was a tall and majestic mountain that blocked out the sun. Chapter 283. It was the tallest mountain that Lu Chen had ever seen in his life. It was even bigger than Kunlun Mountain. The mountain was still far away on the horizon, but just by looking at its tall figure, there was a terrifying aura pressing down on them. It was not a mountain, but a boundless city wall that blocked the heaven and earth. The two ends of the mountain range stretched for tens of thousands of miles, and the end could not be seen. The mountain peak was extremely tall and towered into the sky. About 1,000 feet above the ground, there was a line of snow, and above that was a vast expanse of white snow. The white clouds were misty, layer upon layer. It seemed that they were only at the middle of the mountain, and the higher mountain peaks were so high that they could not be seen. Such a magnificent spectacle was really rare in the world. Lu Chen and Atsu looked ahead and held their breath. But after coming back to his senses, Lu Chen's expression suddenly changed, and an ominous premonition suddenly flashed through his mind. Unlike the vast wasteland where not even a blade of grass grew, he had heard of this towering and exceptionally majestic mountain in the past. Legend has it that in the deepest part of the land of chaos, there was a huge mountain peak that stretched across the land. It was called the Great Snow Mountain. It was the home of the ferocious and valiant barbarian tribe. There were countless ferocious and peerless demonic beasts in the huge mountain range, and the height of the mountain was unimaginably high, reaching into the clouds. Since ancient times, it had the nickname of Pillar of Heaven and Earth. For thousands of years, no one had ever been able to cross this huge mountain. Firstly, the mountain was steep and difficult to climb, and the demonic beasts in the mountain were extremely ferocious. Once one climbed to the top, it was said that there was an extremely cold wind at the top of the mountain that was unheard of in the world. Not to mention flesh and blood, even the ancient beasts, and even the highly skilled Yuaning Jinren could not withstand it. As a result, the Great Snow Mountain became a natural moat that separated the north and the south. The only exception was that after a long period of time, there would be an earth-shattering change on the Great Snow Mountain, and then the beasts would go quiet, the wind and snow would stop, and a road would appear. In the great battle between the humans and the berserkers in the past, the berserkers had seized that chance to attack the north en masse. In the end, they had suffered a crushing defeat. If the huge mountain in front of him was the legendary Great Snow Mountain, didn't that mean that he was no longer in the middle of the land of chaos, but in the core of the land of chaos? He might even be close to the southern wastelands? Lu Chen's expression turned ugly. If that was really the case, then the situation was much worse than he had expected. Sitting on the back of Atsu, he looked left and right. On one side was the barren wilderness, and on the other side was the seemingly smooth-flowing river. Lu Chen frowned. At the same time, he tried his best to recall all the memories he had of the Dragon River. However, no matter how he thought about it, he found that although the river was full of life, it was shrouded in mist. Most importantly, all the questions about where the river flowed to, the answer was almost the same. It turned into the depths of the chaotic lands and disappeared without a trace. His whereabouts are unknown? How could such a huge river disappear without a trace? Why couldn't he just follow the direction of the river? Why couldn't he find it? This seemingly simple question seemed to hide an unfathomable and terrifying secret. Atsu stood quietly, occasionally flicking its tail. Lu Chen pondered in silence for a while, then patted its head and said, "Let's go. No matter what, let's go ahead and take a look." Atsu raised its head and looked at the towering Great Snow Mountain in the distance. It looked at the barren wilderness illuminated by the scorching sun in the sky. Suddenly, it let out a long howl and ran with all its might. Like a black wind, it blew across the barren wilderness and the riverbank. Countless rocks swept past them and disappeared from sight. This run lasted for a very long time. The river was frighteningly long. When the sky darkened, Lu Chen estimated that they had run for at least 100 or 200 kilometers, but the river did not seem to have changed. The scenery in front of them also did not change. It was still a stretch of desolation. This was the result of Atsu's extraordinary endurance after it had advanced to the Holy Beast rank. If it were any other demon beast, it would have collapsed from exhaustion. At dusk, Lu Chen and Atsu stopped and prepared to spend the night on this frighteningly large riverbank. The situation in front of him was very strange. Logically speaking, if he was really near the Great Snow Mountain, then there should be even more dangerous demonic beasts hibernating in the land of chaos. But after running for such a long time, Lu Chen had not encountered a single demonic beast. It was also very strange. Although it was a good thing that they did not encounter the threat of demon beasts, there was another problem. There was no food. This riverbank wasteland was too desolate. Not even a blade of grass grew. Lu Chen and Atsu could not possibly live on rocks. However, Lu Chen and Atsu really ran over to look at some of the big and small rocks on the ground. But this place was really desolate. Other than rocks, there was only wasteland. There was not even a small worm. Fortunately, heaven never bars one's way. Although the riverbank was desolate, at least there was a big river next to it, right? Lu Chen thought of several methods and used almost all the means available to him. Finally, he caught a few fish from the water of the river. The fish in this river were also very different from the fish that Lu Chen had seen in the past. They were almost all different species that he had never seen before. Moreover, they were very fierce and aggressive. Lu Chen and Atsu were almost bitten. But it was also in the process of fishing that Lu Chen unexpectedly discovered that although he could not use his 5 elemental spiritual energy and various means, the power of the black fire seemed to be completely unaffected by the chaotic 5 elemental spiritual energy in this area. He could use it freely. It was also because of this that he was able to catch those big fish in the end. However, when Atsu ate the fish, it looked like it was in pain. From time to time, it would look at Lu Chen with some complaints. Lu Chen stared at the stupid dog and said, "It's good enough that you have something to eat. Isn't the meat a little sour? It's fine." That night, the riverbank was very dark and very cold. Lu Chen almost didn't sleep much. Fortunately, the night passed safely. There were no dangers that only existed at night, and no monsters suddenly crawled out of the river. After dawn, Lu Chen and Atsu continued to move forward. However, after running, Lu Chen quickly felt that today's Atsu was obviously faster than yesterday. At the same time, its body was stronger. Was it the result of eating the fish in the river? A few days ago, when they were hiding in the mysterious tree hole, Lu Chen basically gave Atsu ordinary meat. There was no essence or spiritual energy to speak of. As for the fish that lived in the river, it should be a kind of monster. This stupid dog was really picky. If he didn't give it good food, it wouldn't work. On this day, Atsu's speed was much faster than yesterday. When it was almost noon, the desolate and lifeless scenery that had always been the same finally changed. The first person to notice something wrong was Lu Chen. He saw that the river that had been flowing smoothly suddenly began to become a little turbulent. At the same time, the river seemed to be faintly narrowing. As they continued forward, a rumbling sound suddenly came from the originally quiet wilderness. It was like a thunderclap, like a landslide, and also like a torrent crashing against a hard rock. It made one's heart skip a beat. This time, without waiting for Lu Chen to call, Atsu first slowed down and looked forward. Lu Chen's face was a little dignified. He jumped down from the back of Atsu and looked into the distance. There seemed to be a vague black slowly wriggling in the distance. All the sounds came from that direction, and the river next to him was also flowing in that direction. It seemed that he finally found a result. Lu Chen narrowed his eyes slightly, looked at the darkness in front of him, and then suddenly patted Atsu's head and whispered, "You stay here, I will go and take a look." After saying that, he walked forward. When stepping on the uneven stone beach, Lu Chen suddenly found that there were some black marks on the surface of many stones under his feet. He paused for a moment, squatted down beside a stone with a black mark, and then found that it seemed to be traces of burning. When he stood up, he soon found that the stone beach he was standing on at the moment was almost full of such stones with black marks, and there were countless of them everywhere, covering an astonishingly large area. But, on this barren and desolate river beach, how could there be such a huge sea of fire burning? Things were getting more and more strange, and Lu Chen's pupils also slightly contracted. However, after a moment, he still continued to walk forward. However, after he had taken 3 to 5 steps, he suddenly heard a commotion behind him. When he turned around to look, he saw that Atu had finally caught up to him and walked to his side. Lu Chen was startled, and then he showed a trace of a smile. He didn't say anything, just patted its back, and then one person and one dog continued to walk forward. After walking for a while, the darkness in front of him began to gradually become clear, and the river around him flowed more and more rapidly. The sound of the water was intense like thunder. When they continued to walk forward, an unimaginably huge pit, or a huge cave suddenly appeared in front of Lu Chen's eyes. At this point, the river suddenly made a loud noise, and countless streams of water rushed into the air, then turned into an unimaginably huge waterfall, flew straight down, and fell into the abyss. Yes, this was a dark abyss, a huge and bottomless abyss. The darkness condensed under the abyss, but there were countless light spots flickering in the darkness, emitting a silver-white light, shining like stars in the dark sky. Lightning flashed and thunder rumbled incessantly in the darkness, and one could clearly see that the starlight formed a beautiful picture. The darkness was like a tidal wave, floating and sinking in the abyss, forming a strange scene. When Lu Chen stood at the edge of this abyss, he looked like an insignificant ant, looking at the unimaginable miracle in this world in shock. Chapter 284. The abundant and surging water of the river turned into a huge waterfall, plunging straight into the darkness, and then disappeared without a trace. From afar, it looked like a white jade belt hanging in the night. Standing next to this black and huge abyss, it was as if the sky and earth had been turned upside down. The night sky was below, and the earth was above. The darkness and the strange starlight and white light formed a strange scene, and it was not static. Like clouds flowing, everything in the abyss seemed to be rotating, just like the vast and boundless galaxy in the sky had produced a terrifying vortex, as if it was going to devour everything in this world. Lightning flashed, twisting and passing through the black cloudy galaxy, and there were bursts of low but majestic thunder from the depths of the abyss from time to time. Occasionally, when two blazing and dazzling lightning collided, it suddenly burst out an unimaginably dazzling light, illuminating the deep night sky, but then it quickly dimmed, and then was swallowed by an even larger wave of darkness. Lu Chen only felt that his throat was a little dry. He stared blankly at the strange scenery below, which was almost beyond human imagination, and was shocked by this huge and incredible scene. Just as Lu Chen was lost in thought, he suddenly heard a few hurried roars from beside him. Immediately after, he felt a grip on his wrist, and a sharp pain accompanied by a great force that pulled him backwards abruptly came over. Lu Chen let out a pained groan, and his body jolted awake. He saw that Atu had opened his mouth for some unknown reason, and was biting his hand with all his might, trying to drag it backwards. He was shocked and angry, and just when he was about to scold, his body suddenly trembled, and he found that he had already walked to the edge of the abyss, and half of his foot was already hanging outside. If he took half a step forward, he would directly fall into this mysterious and terrible abyss. It turned out that just now, unknowingly, he seemed to have lost his consciousness. If it were not for Atsu, who was still awake and pulled him back, the consequences would be unimaginable. Lu Chen hurriedly retracted his foot, which was already halfway into the abyss, and took a few steps back. His face was a little pale, and he was gasping for breath. At the same time, he was horrified. This mysterious abyss seemed to have a strange power that could make people walk into a trap. It was really creepy. After a while, Lu Chen calmed down a little, but he didn't dare to look at this strange abyss anymore. He turned around and touched the head of Atsu, who was standing beside him. Just when he was about to speak, he suddenly saw the huge mountain in the distance. His body trembled again. In that instant, he suddenly knew where this place was. Under the great snow mountain in the Chaos Abyss. The Great Snow Mountain, the Primal Chaos Abyss, and the Shattered Spirit Sand Sea. These three places were the most dangerous and terrifying core areas of the Land of Chaos. When he and Atsu hid in the mysterious tree hole, the river water of the Dragon River had actually washed the seed all the way to the deepest part of the Land of Chaos. Even in the flourishing cultivation world of the human race, It had been many years since anyone had come close to the core areas of the Land of Chaos. These most dangerous places in the world seemed to have become legends. This result far exceeded Lu Chen's initial plans. One had to know that he had only wanted to take the risk to enter the central area of the Land of Chaos. After standing in place for a while, Lu Chen shook his head and sighed helplessly. He glanced at Atsu and found that Atsu was also looking at him with concern, as if worried that this man had been scared silly. "All right, at least we are still alive," Lu Chen said to Atsu in a self-deprecating manner and shrugged his shoulders. No matter what, standing so close to the primal chaos abyss, one of the three most dangerous places in the Land of Chaos, was not a pleasant thing, even if it seemed like nothing had happened for the time being. "Let's go and take a look at the other places," Lu Chen said to Atsu and turned to leave. Atsu was just about to follow when all of a sudden, the black wolf's fur stood on end and it bared its fangs. It let out a ferocious growl once again, as if it had seen a terrifying beast, revealing a look of terror. Lu Chen was shocked. Just as he was about to comfort Atsu, he suddenly felt the ground beneath his feet shake violently. Then, several earth-shattering claps of thunder rang out from the primal chaos abyss. Lu Chen turned to look in the direction of the sound and saw that the river in the distance, which had already become turbulent, suddenly began to twist and ripple. In the huge abyss, black waves surged violently, each wave higher than the one before. Lightning was swimming around crazily. Rays of starlight shone brightly. The darkness was full and surging. The dark vortex spun faster and faster. Suddenly, there was a moment when everything stopped. Heaven and earth held their breath and all things froze. All of a sudden, a loud noise that seemed to tear the sky and shatter the vault of heaven rang out from the abyss of chaos. A dark torrent rushed straight up to the sky from the depths of the whirlpool. All the clouds and mist were scattered in front of this terrible dark torrent. They could only stare at this strange scene that pierced through the sky. The clouds in the sky changed color. After a while, the giant black pillar gradually shrunk and disappeared. The primal chaos abyss slowly regained its calm. Lu Chen was shocked. Suddenly he saw a small black dot appear in the sky. The black dot fell from the sky at a very fast speed. It gradually became bigger and bigger in his sight. It turned out to be a fist-sized black stone burning with flames. With an astonishing whistling sound, it fell from the sky. After a while, it smashed heavily on the ground hundreds of feet away from Lu Chen and Atsu, making a deafening roar. The ground trembled, and the black fire burned high into the sky. The ground was immediately scorched black. At the same time, sand and stones flew. Obviously, the force of the impact was astonishing. Lu Chen looked at the burning flames and the big pit on the ground. Suddenly, his face changed. At that moment, he suddenly thought of the black marks left on the ground. "Go!" He suddenly let out an angry roar, flipped over and jumped onto Atsu's back, hugged its neck and shouted, "Run!" Atsu seemed to have sensed something. It let out a long roar and rushed out with all its might. At the same time, in the boundless sky, a second black dot appeared, then a third, a fourth, more and more until it was impossible to count. The entire sky was filled with black falling rocks, carrying with them endless flames and terrifying whistling sounds as they fell to the ground. Atsu roared and ran. Its body was as agile as lightning. It jumped and weaved, and even the rocks of different heights couldn't stop it. But soon, the burning black stones that fell from the sky began to hit the ground. At first, it was one or two stones. Soon, it was too much for the eyes to take in. The roar was deafening. The sound of explosions and the trembling of the ground were endless. The burning flames began to spread across the land. Every falling boulder would cause a sea of fire and a large amount of sand and dust. Carrying Lu Chen on its back, Atsu desperately ran away in this doomsday-like scene. It passed through every narrow gap and dodged the feast of the Grim Reaper. Even if the flames burned its skin and flesh, it didn't flinch. There were many times when it was only a thin line between life and death. The terrifying rain of fire covered the land. If Atsu made the slightest mistake, it and Lu Chen would stay on this land forever. But in the end, Atsu still roared and rushed out with its body covered in flames and dust. It avoided the falling stones along the way and left the seemingly endless rain of fire behind. The thrill of the journey was indescribable. Even Lu Chen himself felt that he was in a desperate situation and couldn't escape anymore. But in the end, Atsu, the magical holy beast that was only good at escaping, exerted all its strength and finally brought him out. When the rain of fire subsided and the world became peaceful again, Lu Chen and Atsu stood at the edge of the land that had become a sea of fire. When they looked back, they were both speechless. At this moment, their bodies were all gray and black. Lu Chen's clothes and Atsu's fur were torn and burned in many places. And in the place where they were just now, no living creature could survive within a radius of more than 100 miles. Lu Chen finally knew where the black marks on the stones that he saw before came from. A dangerous place like the Chaos Abyss was indeed extraordinarily terrifying. And when he looked back into the distance, a desolate and withered wasteland appeared in front of him. It was boundless. "Let's go, Atsu," he said softly. Atsu responded in a low voice. It wagged its tail and followed him into the vast and desolate distance. At that time, the sun was setting in the west. Under the setting sun, their shadows were particularly long and thin, and they were cast on the desolate and boundless desert. Chapter 285. Lu Chen and Atsu barely avoided the terrifying rain of fire from the primal chaos abyss. It could be said that they had a narrow escape from death. Without any hesitation, they left the area. They could not go to the Great Snow Mountain either. It was a dangerous place that was on par with the abyss of chaos. Even if they went there, they would most likely die. As for the remaining path, they did not have many choices. On one side was the boundless desert, while the other was to walk back along the rocky beach and look upstream of the river. After much thought, Lu Chen finally decided to turn back and walk upstream. If this river was the Longchuan River, they might have a chance of finding their way back. As for the seemingly vast wasteland, it was too easy to associate it with the broken spirit sand sea that was on par with the abyss of chaos and the Great Snow Mountain. Although Lu Chen could not be sure that it was that place, if the abyss of chaos and the Great Snow Mountain had both appeared, it would not be strange for the broken spirit sand sea to appear as well. In this strange and unpredictable region, danger lurked everywhere. If they wanted to survive, they had to be careful. Even so, Lu Chen did not have much confidence that they would be able to walk out of this dangerous place. They slowly approached the river and began to swim upstream. At the same time, Lu Chen carefully maintained a distance from the river. He would only approach the river when he needed to feed on the fish in the river. Just like that, they walked for a few days without encountering any accidents. Although this was a good thing, Lu Chen still felt a little strange. It was hard to say if he had not been to the Great Snow Mountain, but the abyss of chaos that he had seen was an incomparably strange and dangerous place. It was very much in line with the legendary core zone of the disorienting lands. However, the legends also said that the disorienting lands was dangerous to the point where danger lurks every 3 steps and danger every 5 steps. Not to mention ordinary people, even Yuanyin Zhenren would have to be on high alert to deal with it. However, he had been walking here for a few days without encountering any danger. This was a little strange. Something did not seem right? During this period of time, he was suddenly in this dangerous place. Naturally, it was because when he hid in the seed, he was somehow swept here by the river. Lu Chen originally thought that he would be able to find some clues to return after walking upstream for a few days, but now he realized that he might have been wrong. Although he didn't remember staying in that mysterious tree hole for too long, at least with the gluttonous Atsu around, the food wouldn't last that long. But now, after walking for several days, Lu Chen found that the surrounding scenery did not seem to have changed at all. It was still a river and a desolate plain. Come to think of it, it was probably only when it was at the bottom of the Dragon River that the tiny seed was instantly washed far away by the rapid currents. That was how it managed to arrive at the abyss of chaos in this period of time. With this uncertain guess, Lu Chen and Atsu walked for a few more days. About 9 days after they left the abyss of chaos, they finally noticed something unusual. There was no change in the surging river, nor in the vast wilderness. However, in a patch of yellow sand ahead, Lu Chen saw a corpse that had decayed beyond recognition. The skeleton buried in the yellow sand looked a little scary, but after discovering it, Lu Chen's spirits were lifted and he was very happy. No matter what, the appearance of a skeleton meant that someone had been here before. To him, this was equivalent to a timely piece of news. The skeleton was extremely decayed, and most of it had been weathered into sand. Even the sturdiest skull had decayed in many places. However, after careful observation, Lu Chen quickly frowned and a strange look flashed across his eyes. This skeleton that had died at an unknown time looked like a human, but Lu Chen saw a broken fang near the jaw. He was shocked because it was impossible for a human to have this. This dead person was a barbarian. Atsu walked to Lu Chen's side and raised its head to look at him. Lu Chen straightened his body. After a moment of silence, he said to Atsu in a low voice, let's go forward and take a look. I hope my guess is wrong." At this moment, Lu Chen was guessing in his heart. He did not say anything, and Atsu had no way to ask. Of course, although Atsu was now a holy beast, it still did not know the human language, so it could not ask. The two of them stepped over the skeleton and continued forward. The dry wind blew from the wilderness and blew up a patch of yellow sand, drowning the hideous skeleton. The discovery of this skeleton was like a watershed. From this day onwards, the direction that Lu Chen and Atsu were moving in began to change. Grass and trees began to appear on this piece of land. Although they were sparse and did not form a forest, it was clear that the situation was slowly improving. The aura of life began to thicken in this piece of land. Later, Lu Chen actually saw a small oasis formed by a small forest in the desert. There were some small animals there, but they were not demonic beasts. They looked a little strange and seemed to be very different from the creatures in the divine central continent. At the very least, some of the beasts in this place looked very weak. Lu Chen caught two beasts that looked similar to wild rabbits as a way to improve his and Atsu's meals. It was unknown whether it was because no one had come here for a long time, but these weak beasts did not seem to be able to resist. However, Atsu seemed to have no interest in the meat of these weak beasts. It used its mouth to pull Lu Chen's clothes and dragged him toward the river. It looked like it wanted to eat the fish in the river. Lu Chen was also helpless. In the end, he could only help it catch two more beasts to deal with it. After that, they continued to move forward. Lu Chen had a feeling that the change he was looking for might be right in front of him. However, this change came very quickly and was also very big, so much so that Lu Chen was somewhat unprepared. On the second morning after he left the small oasis, he and Atsu were still walking upstream in a desolate wasteland when they suddenly heard a strange noise coming from the desert in the distance. The sound was unusually desolate and tragic, and the tone was boundless, as if it was recalling an ancient epic to the heavens. However, Lu Chen's expression immediately turned ugly because he felt that the voice was a little familiar. After thinking for a moment, he felt that this voice was similar to the voice of the old shaman he had heard in the battle with the barbarian tribe in the mountain ridge next to the evil Python Valley. This discovery made him look a little solemn. He informed Atsu, and then quietly ran toward the source of the sound. There was a big sand dune about 100 feet in front of them. Lu Chen and Atsu ran in that direction. As they got closer, more and more sounds came. It was like the howling of wild beasts, the blood-boiling sound of war drums, the crazy roars, and the roars seemed to be mixed with a bit of majesty. They climbed up, and then when they reached the top of the sand dune, they quietly poked their heads out. A battlefield appeared in front of them. It was a fierce battle involving hundreds of people. It was fierce and bloody, crazy and tyrannical. It was unfolding in front of them without any warning. About 100 feet below the sand dune, all the warriors on the battlefield were tall and burly barbarian warriors with tusks in their mouths. Most of them were bare-chested, and they were holding weapons made of huge stones in their hands. They were fighting in a violent manner. This battle seemed to be halfway through, and it had reached the most intense moment. Both sides were in a killing frenzy. Blood flowed everywhere, and corpses were everywhere. It was unknown how many barbarians had been decapitated, and their limbs were severed. The scene was extremely bloody. Atsu let out a low growl, and it seemed to be a little nervous. Lu Chen gently patted its head, but his expression didn't look good either. He turned his head and looked at the road they had come from, and the unusually long and wide river. He was speechless for a moment. Such a fierce battle between barbarians must be a war between two big tribes, and it was impossible for such a situation to happen in such a dangerous environment like the chaotic land. He secretly smiled bitterly. With a bit of self-mockery, he whispered to himself, "I've actually been washed to the southern wilderness." Yes, it was very likely that Lu Chen and Atsu were in the southern wilderness, where only the barbarians lived. The great snow mountain and the abyss of chaos he had seen were all real. But what was different from what he had imagined was that he and Atsu were now on the other side of the most dangerous area in the chaotic land. Perhaps he was the first human to set foot in the southern wilderness in thousands of years? Of course, this wasn't something to be happy about. The southern barbarian territory had been separated from the chaotic lands for thousands of years, and there were almost no humans here. Moreover, if the legends were true, there were many barbarians who had the vile habit of eating human flesh. Similarly, if this was the southern wilderness, it could finally explain why the spiritual power of the five elements was so abnormal that it almost crippled Lu Chen's cultivation. On the other hand, the power of the black flame in Lu Chen's body was not damaged at all. It was probably because this power originated from this place. He smiled bitterly in his heart, and also had a headache about how to survive in the future. But with a loud roar, Lu Chen's attention was quickly drawn to the battle. He saw that at the back of one of the barbarian tribes, there seemed to be someone who was finally dissatisfied with this bloody and indecisive war. Then, a barbarian dressed in black and looking like a priest walked out. He raised his hands to the sky and loudly chanted an incantation. After a while, a magic tool appeared in his hand, which seemed to be a piece of yellow wood. Then, as he chanted the incantation faster and faster, the yellow wood began to light up with runes, and a strong spiritual power began to fill the air. Totem power? Lu Chen's expression immediately turned solemn. This scene was very similar to that of the barbarian tribe he had seen in the disordered land. He just didn't know if the effect of this priest's spell would be the same as that of the old priests. Lu Chen stared at that side, his eyes shining. Chapter 286. The ancient incantation began to reverberate in the sky above the fierce battlefield, and immediately caused a commotion among the warriors on both sides. The difference was that the warriors on the side with the priest all revealed expressions of joy, while the warriors on the other side had expressions of fear on their faces. It was hard to imagine that not long ago, these incomparably valiant barbarian warriors, who would rather die than retreat in the face of blood and slaughter, would actually be afraid of the power of the priest. It seemed that to these warriors, this strange power was more awe-inspiring than death itself. Of course, Lu Chen could not understand this inexplicable mentality. They were not even afraid of bleeding to death, and yet they were afraid of this unknown magic? Come to think of it, perhaps these barbarian warriors had been instilled with the idea that the priest's magic was unparalleled since they were young. Otherwise, it was really incomprehensible. However, at this moment, he could not care about these things because when he saw the magic staff in the hands of the priest when he cast the spell, his heart suddenly moved. He immediately reached out to touch his chest, and in the next moment, the half of the fire god's staff appeared in his hand. From afar, he compared the half of the fire god's staff with the magic staff in the hands of the distant priest. Very quickly, Lu Chen noticed that there was a huge difference between the two. The color of the magic staff in the hands of the priest was bright, and the whole body was smooth. Many runes were directly engraved on the magic staff, and even when it was not casting a spell, it could still be seen very clearly. However, after the priest cast the spell, although the entire magic staff emitted a yellow light, and the runes also lit up, it was in the form of dots. Many of the runes did not respond, and were still dark. Those dots of light also did not show any signs of connecting. Recalling the appearance of the fire god's staff when it was stimulated by the black fire spiritual power, Lu Chen discovered that all the twisted and complicated runes on the fire god's staff had a natural feeling of blending with water. Once the fire god's staff was stimulated by the spiritual power was like a stream of water, flowing through all the runes in the blink of an eye. Every place and every rune would light up, forming an incomparably complete totem. Up until now, the fire god's staff in Lu Chen's hands was only emitting light, barely able to be used as a torch. However, Lu Chen still felt that the fire god's staff should be much stronger than the staff in the priest's hands. Perhaps, just like what the old priest of the barbarian tribe had said before his death, this was a divine weapon? The fire god's divine weapon, the fire god's choice? Lu Chen curled his lips and put down the Vulcan staff. On the battlefield below, the priest had already finished chanting his incantation. Soon, a powerful force was emitted from the staff in his hand. Several yellow rays of light shot out and shot into the ground in front of him. At the same time, Lu Chen suddenly felt a slight warmth in his hand, and Atsu, who had been lying beside him, suddenly moved a little to the side, as if it was startled by something. After a while, their gazes looked down at the same time. They saw that the half of the Vulcan staff was actually trembling by itself. A ray of light that was not particularly bright was flickering in the runes on the body of the staff. However, the Vulcan staff's reaction stopped there. It gave off a feeling of disdain. After the light flickered for a while, it gradually dimmed. On the battlefield below the sand dune, there was already a strange change. At the center of the battlefield where the two sides were fighting fiercely, the ground suddenly trembled violently. The surrounding barbarian warriors suddenly lost their balance and fell to the ground. After a while, a low rumbling sound came from the ground. A large area of sand and stones suddenly arched up. Smoke and dust flew everywhere, and countless small stones rolled down. Then, under the shocked gazes of the crowd, a huge stone puppet that was more than 2 feet tall appeared on the battlefield. This stone puppet, whose entire body was condensed from stones and sand, raised its head towards the sky and roared. Its voice was like thunder, then it slowly turned around and walked towards the enemy camp. With every step it took, the ground would tremble. This indicated that the stone puppet's body was abnormally heavy. Looking at the terrifying stone giant that had suddenly appeared, it was obvious that it was not an opponent that ordinary people could fight against. The barbarian warriors who had been fighting bravely before also began to show signs of hesitation and fear in their eyes. Some of them even began to retreat. The situation of the battlefield that was originally evenly matched was suddenly reversed after the appearance of the stone puppet. The morale of the barbarian warriors who had the power of the priest had obviously risen. All the barbarian warriors roared and rushed forward. They either slashed and chased after the stone puppet, or directly entangled the opponent so that the stone puppet behind them could catch up. Seeing that the situation was about to get out of control, a few people suddenly jumped out from the back of the barbarian warriors who were at a disadvantage. But none of these people were like the priest. They seemed to be stronger warriors and leaders. They shouted at their subordinates and drove them back to fight. Lu Chen was watching from the side of the sand dune. He could also see that something was wrong. The barbarian army with the priest had a unified command. Even their clothing was similar. On the other side, although the number of barbarian warriors wasn't small, but after a long time, he could see that the warriors of several different tribes had joined forces to fight together. These barbarian warriors were also very brave and valiant. But when the leader of the barbarian warriors came out, the situation immediately became chaotic. The warriors of each tribe only listened to the leader of their tribe. So, the scene suddenly became chaotic. The stone puppet had dragged its heavy body to the front. It let out a loud roar and kicked its huge stone foot towards the barbarian warriors. A gust of wind blew past, and a few barbarian warriors who couldn't dodge in time were kicked. Immediately, deafening screams could be heard, and a few bodies were kicked away. Blood splattered everywhere, and their bones were broken and their flesh was torn. Then, the stone puppet raised its arm and smashed its huge fist into the crowd of barbarian warriors. Boom! The ground shook, and a few barbarian warriors who couldn't dodge in time were smashed into a pile of flesh and blood. The other barbarian warriors seemed to be scared out of their wits. They screamed madly and retreated with all their might. It seemed that they wanted to get as far away from this inhumane stone puppet as possible. The situation instantly collapsed. Even though the leaders of the allied army were trying their best to drive their warriors away, they couldn't control the barbarian warriors who were retreating. On the opposite side, a large group of warriors were laughing wildly. They were waving their blood-stained blades and were following the stone puppet. On the side of the allied army, everyone's faces were ashen, and despair could be seen on their faces. Some of them seemed to be extremely angry. They tore their clothes, beat their chests, and roared, Why do they have a priest? Didn't the priest of the mountain spirit tribe die decades ago? Blood splattered everywhere on the bloody battlefield. Many people were bleeding and collapsing, and an even greater massacre was about to descend. Lu Qin, who was hiding behind a sand dune in the distance, didn't feel anything. He had been used to death and blood for so many years. Once he hardened his heart, he could be extremely cold. Not to mention that both sides were barbarians, so he didn't feel the slightest bit of sympathy for them. So, when one side was about to be slaughtered, he didn't feel anything. He just calmly watched for a while, and felt that he shouldn't stay here any longer. Once the battle was over, the barbarians on the winning side would definitely clean up the battlefield. At that time, if he wasn't careful and was discovered by the barbarian warriors who had just escaped from the battle, it would be a big problem. Especially the priest hiding in the depths of the battle. Although Lu Qin faintly felt that the priest's methods, especially his magic staff, were not as good as the fire god's staff that he had obtained, but the various strange witchcraft and methods of the southern border barbarians were still hard to guard against. So, he finally decided not to cause any trouble. He turned his head and called out to Atsu softly, "Let's go." Atsu wagged its tail and crawled up from the ground. Lu Qin was about to retreat down the sand dune when he found that the fire god's staff was still in his hand. At this moment, it was still slightly hot, but the light on the staff was almost gone. He shrugged his shoulders and was about to put away the fire god's staff when he suddenly found that the priest in the distance had a solemn expression on his face. His hands were twisting in the air, as if he was in the process of controlling the stone puppet. Seeing that victory was in his grasp, it was obvious that the priest's face revealed an obvious look of arrogance. Then he looked around and saw that the barbarian warriors surrounding him were all looking at him with reverence. The way they looked at him was like that of a god. The priest was extremely pleased with himself and couldn't help but laugh out loud. He had the intention to show off. As long as I can completely make these brainless barbarians who only have a body of flesh and blood respect me, I can successfully subdue this mountain spirit tribe. When I return to the war god temple, I'm sure the few shamans will be even more satisfied with me. The priest snorted coldly and made up his mind. He grabbed the staff beside him with both hands and didn't seem to cast a spell. In the blink of an eye, a violent force flowed out from the staff and poured into the distance. The power accompanied by the blazing yellow light directly passed over the heads of the crowd and landed on the stone puppet. Immediately, the originally incomparably powerful stone puppet seemed to have suddenly been stimulated, and its movements actually became twice as fast as before. Even the most obvious flaw was almost fixed. With this, the stone puppet became even more of a terrifying killing machine. It swept across the battlefield and slaughtered flesh and blood. In the blink of an eye, it was about to kill its way through the enemy's formation. The priest laughed out loud and the barbarians around him cried out in surprise. Their faces were full of reverence and they looked as if they were about to kneel on the ground. It was also at this moment that the fire god's staff, which had calmed down in Lu Qin's hand, suddenly lit up. Just like a will that had been provoked again. Chapter 287. It was a sudden ray of light that rose from the fire god's staff. The entire sand dune seemed to be shrouded in this ray of light in an instant. It was majestic and turbulent, and the light was like fire, roaring loudly. Almost at the same time, all the barbarian warriors who were immersed in the bloody slaughter and life and death situation on the battlefield did not notice the abnormality on the sand dune next to the battlefield. The only one who felt it was the priest who was casting the spell with the staff in his hand. The earthy yellow staff that was at its peak state and invincible on the battlefield suddenly trembled violently. A few rays of light immediately shot back and returned to the staff, flickering nonstop, as if it was vigilant. The stone puppet in front of it seemed to have lost a part of its strength, and its speed and agility also slowed down. But even so, this terrifying and powerful stone puppet was still a terrifying existence that could not be defeated on the battlefield. The situation of the battle still did not change, and even the two sides did not feel anything wrong. At most, they thought that the priest felt that this little bit of power was enough to win, and there was no need to waste any more energy. However, at this moment, the priest's face suddenly became solemn. Just at that moment, he clearly felt a powerful origin power suddenly appear around him. This kind of pure and powerful spiritual power was something he had only seen from the few shamans in the war god temple in the past. Could it be that a powerful shaman had suddenly come here? The moment this thought surfaced in his mind, the priest's face instantly turned pale. Like the surrounding barbarian warriors who worshipped him, he was even more in awe of the few shamans who were at the peak of the barbarian race's power. He did not even dare to think of making an enemy out of them. However, very soon, the priest noticed that something was wrong. Because other than the wave of spiritual power, he did not feel the monstrous aura that seemed to be able to cover the sky and cover the sun that he was so familiar with. This discovery made the priest feel slightly relieved, and his eyes immediately swept around. After a moment, his eyes fell on the sand dune at the side of the battlefield. There seemed to be a ball of fire burning there, and the fire seemed to be enveloping the entire hill. And the wave of spiritual power that he felt before was coming from there. After seeing the fire, the priest could not help but be startled. Fire's spiritual power? Didn't this power disappear from the wilderness for thousands of years? A moment later, the priest sneered and a look of understanding appeared in his eyes. Only the shamans of the barbarian tribe could master the true 5 elemental spiritual powers of gold, wood, water, fire, and earth. Priests like him could only cultivate various kinds of secondary spiritual powers, but their power was equally powerful. Thinking of this, he felt a little disgusted with the enemy hiding on the sand dune. This was to disrupt his plan to subdue the mountain spirit race. Even if the other side hadn't made a move yet, as long as they affected this area, they would become his enemy. Since it wasn't Lord Shaman, then there was nothing to be afraid of. This priest himself was an extremely talented rising star in the war god temple. If it wasn't for the fact that his background wasn't too good and he didn't have the backing of a powerful tribe, his achievements would have been much greater than what he was now. It was precisely because of this that he was even more eager to subdue a tribe for his own use. But in the barbarian wasteland, all the tribes insisted on a single belief in the power of the totem. Apart from worshipping their ancestors, the barbarian tribes only worshipped one kind of totem. For example, a tribe that worshipped a fire totem would never believe in the power of a water totem. The totem's spiritual power of this priest belonged to the earth totem system of the 5 elements. He wanted to find a tribe that worshipped an earth power. Moreover, this tribe had already lost its priest, so the tribe couldn't be too weak. Otherwise, it wouldn't be able to provide him with all kinds of strong support, and it would be useless to subdue it. Therefore, subduing the mountain spirit race was something he couldn't afford to fail. Originally, he had basically controlled the morale of the mountain spirit race. In today's battle against 4 small tribes, as long as he won the battle, the mountain spirit race would be completely loyal to him. Just as he was about to succeed, an accident had occurred. This time, he couldn't back down no matter what. The priest picked up his magic staff and started to chant a mysterious incantation. His body turned half a circle, no longer facing the front of the battlefield. Instead, he looked in the direction of the sand dune. The leaders of the mountain spirit race next to the priest soon noticed that something was wrong. They raised their heads and looked at the strange fire on the sand dune. Suddenly, their faces changed. However, seeing that the priest was calm and composed, and that he was directly attacking the sand dune, they felt relieved. In this battle, the high priest had already proven his strength. A yellow light rose up like a vast and boundless wasteland. It turned into a huge fist in midair, and then smashed down on the sand dune. Lu Chen, who was hiding behind the sand dune, had a helpless expression on his face. According to his original intention, he did not care whether the two barbarians fought to the death. It had nothing to do with him. Just as he was about to leave, who would have thought that the fire god's staff would do something like this? Although Lu Chen didn't know why the barbarian priest was so decisive and didn't even hesitate to attack them, it was obvious that the priest regarded them as an enemy. The fire god's staff emitted raging flames, and the body of the staff became hotter and hotter. It seemed to be very angry. Perhaps the priest thought that the other side was bold and dared to provoke him? But even if he did provoke him, there was nothing he could do. Lu Chen was helpless against the fire god's staff that could only be used as a torch for illumination. Seeing that the other party's powerful fist was about to smash down, in a moment of desperation, he could only channel the power of the black fire in his body into the fire god's staff. The black fire flashed in his eyes. Almost at the same time, the fire god's staff shone with a strange light. All the totem runes appeared at the same time, and a pure and powerful spiritual power gushed out. It was fire. Black fire. Lu Chen was so shocked that he couldn't speak for a moment. He had tried countless times in the ancient tree hole, but he couldn't activate the fire god's staff. He didn't expect that there would be a change when he used it today. As the black flames on the Vulcan staff rose up, it immediately devoured all the original flames, turning them into dark flames. The entire sand dune seemed to darken in the blink of an eye. Then a huge shadow appeared in midair, whistling as it flew. The giant fist of the barbarian priest smashed fiercely into the black shadow. But it was immediately entangled by the black flames. Then a terrifying scene occurred. The black flames started to corrode the giant fist from all directions. Then, the giant fist started to emit a low-pitched sound that sounded like the wailing of ghosts and the howling of wolves. In the blink of an eye, the entire giant fist was corroded. The last bit of light tried to escape, but it was engulfed by the sea of black shadows. It didn't even make a sound before it disappeared. In the distance, the barbarian priest's face suddenly turned pale. He spat out a mouthful of blood. His expression changed greatly, and his eyes were filled with disbelief and fear. At that moment, he seemed to have seen a ghost. He lost his composure and shouted, "Devil fire, this is the power of the black fire." His voice suddenly became hoarse. A moment later, a flame suddenly emerged from his throat. It burned crazily and danced wildly in the black shadow. It burnt and melted his flesh. The priest screamed at the sky. He even threw away the staff in his hand. He covered his throat with both hands and fell to the ground. He started to struggle and twitch. The barbarians of the mountain spirit tribe were shocked. They were all dumbfounded. They didn't know what had happened. One of the more courageous barbarian leaders, out of respect for the priest, took the risk to help and extinguish the flames on the priest's body. But in an instant, the black flames spread from the priest's body to his own body. A shrill scream came from the mouth of the strong barbarian warrior. He was not afraid of bloodshed, but at this moment he seemed to be suffering from an unimaginable pain. He fell to the ground, twisting and struggling with all his strength. The surrounding barbarians screamed again and again. They instantly retreated to the side, forming a large circle. They could only watch as the two people in the middle were burned to death by the strange and terrible black fire. In the end, only 2 charred skeletons were left. When the priest died in pain and madness, the stone puppet on the distant battlefield suddenly stopped moving. A moment later, this incomparably powerful killing machine seemed to have lost the support of its skeleton. All the stones and sand shattered, disintegrating into a large pile of scattered rubble, and collapsed with a loud bang. On the battlefield, there was a sudden silence. The barbarian warriors on both sides didn't seem to know what had happened. They looked at each other with their mouths agape. But then, a mournful scream came from the back of the mountain spirit tribe's camp. It resounded through the battlefield, and the situation suddenly changed. Countless mountain spirit tribe warriors looked back. They didn't know who shouted, "The priest is dead," but the crowd immediately fell into chaos. On the other hand, the morale of the allied soldiers of the few tribes was greatly boosted. A few of the leaders even seized the opportunity to roar out commands. A few of the warrior leaders even took the lead and charged into the battlefield, instantly setting off a furious counterattack. The mountain spirit tribe's side seemed to have fallen from the highest point. The whole formation trembled because of the priest's death. Then it began to collapse. The result of relying too much on a powerful force was that when that force disappeared, they would be weaker and smaller than ordinary people. The tide of battle turned in an instant. In the blink of an eye, the front line of the mountain spirit tribe's warriors had fallen. Blood splattered everywhere. Everyone turned around and fled. Behind the crowd, someone from the allied tribes suddenly roared, "Fire God! Fire God! The fire god has been reborn." Chapter 288. There was no turning back in that battle. The mountain spirit tribe's morale were completely shattered by the sudden death of the shaman. They were chased and slaughtered by the joint army of several tribes. Blood flowed all the way, and at least half of the mountain spirit tribe's warriors were killed, and they fled in panic. The mountain spirit tribe couldn't be ranked at the top among the barbarian tribes of the southern wilderness. Their overall strength was probably a little lower than the middle level. But after such a big battle, they had lost more than half of their elite warriors. It was a big blow to the mountain spirit tribe's strength. If they didn't have any more opportunities or powerful talents, they would inevitably fall into the ranks of the weak tribes. Different from the gloomy outlook of the defeated, the victors were full of excitement and joy. The armies of the few tribes chased after the mountain spirits for a long distance. The mountain spirits paid the price of more blood and human lives. After dying a bloody path, the armies of the few tribes returned triumphantly. Lu Chen, who was standing on the sand dune, wanted to leave before the fire god's staff quietened down. However, he soon discovered that he had been surrounded by the barbarian leaders and a portion of their subordinates. Lu Chen sighed and looked into the distance. He saw that the warriors in the distance were cleaning up the battlefield. There seemed to be two important things. The first was to check whether the fallen warriors were still alive. If they were comrades, they would help them back for treatment. If they were enemies of the mountain spirit tribe, they would smash their heads and stomp on their chests so that they would die a more thorough death. For a time, the battlefield was once again filled with blood-curdling screams, accompanied by the maniacal laughter of the victorious barbarian warriors, turning the battlefield into a bloody scene. Other than that, they were probably looting. The so-called belongings were actually the belongings of the dead, such as weapons, accessories, and even clothes. Many warriors of the mountain spirit tribe were stripped naked after they died, and fell to the ground in shame and dignity. What was even more surprising was that the barbarian warriors of the other tribes, who had fought together in the bloody battle, were not only looting the dead warriors of the mountain spirit tribe, but also looting the dead warriors of the other tribes, as if they had gone mad from poverty. But in this way, disputes immediately arose. Everyone wanted to rob others, but their dead brothers absolutely could not be humiliated like this. So, there was an immediate uproar on the battlefield. For a moment, many people pulled out their weapons, and the atmosphere became somewhat tense. This had alarmed the few barbarian leaders who had come to the sand dune. Fortunately, these barbarian leaders still had some brains. They turned around and ran back, kicking, cursing, and yelling. Finally, they managed to restrain their subordinates. They separated most of the barbarian warriors and slowly returned to their own camps. However, they naturally wouldn't return the things that they had snatched from the barbarian leaders. In this way, the battlefield finally quieted down, leaving only a miserable and ugly scene. Most of the barbarians seemed to be used to this kind of situation. Although they were fighting fiercely just now, they seemed to have forgotten about this matter after a while. They were happily counting their spoils of war. Those who had a lot of spoils of war were laughing loudly, while those who had a little bit of spoils of war were dejected. Compared to these useless barbarian warriors, the barbarian chiefs ran back to the sand dune. It was only now that the Vulcan staff in Lu Chen's hand had completely calmed down. It no longer glowed or heated up, and the totem patterns had completely disappeared. It looked just like a smooth staff. How did a human feel when he was surrounded by a large group of barbarians in the southern border? Lu Chen felt that he had roughly understood. He looked at the barbarians who were slowly encircling him from both sides of the sand dune. He frowned slightly and looked left and right from time to time, thinking about how to escape. And beside him, Atsu also seemed to feel the danger. His eyes revealed an ominous glint, and he bared his fangs. A low growl came from his throat, and he stared at the enemies who were encircling him from afar. After seeing the appearance of Lu Chen, who was standing at the highest point of the sand dune, all the barbarians subconsciously stopped in their tracks. Everyone's face revealed a look of astonishment, as if they had seen something unimaginable. After a moment, someone suddenly shouted, "Human race!" After this shout, the crowd of barbarians instantly burst into an uproar. Suddenly, there was a series of ping ping pang pang sounds. It was unknown how many people instantly pulled out their weapons. They roared angrily, and it seemed that they were about to rush over and hack Lu Chen to death. Lu Chen's pupils shrank slightly. He took a step back and placed a hand on Atu's back. Just as he was about to move, the fire god's staff in his hand, which had already calmed down, suddenly flashed. A beam of flame swayed. It did not have a strong aura, but it was very obvious that it swayed towards a certain direction in the crowd of barbarians. All the barbarians suddenly froze for a moment. Their faces revealed a look of astonishment and instinctive reverence, but it seemed that the hatred in their hearts was even greater. Moreover, they did not quite believe that a human could possess such a legendary power. Therefore, they still shouted loudly and were about to rush over and tear Lu Chen into thousands of pieces. But at this moment, suddenly, a tribe leader in the crowd of barbarians roared fiercely. He took a few steps and rushed to the front, and suddenly ran in front of Lu Chen. Lu Chen's face was stern, and a black flame flashed in his eyes. When he was about to attack, he suddenly saw that the abnormally burly barbarian leader stared at him. Especially when he saw the black flame that flashed in Lu Chen's eyes, his entire face suddenly revealed an indescribable excitement. "Roar!" He suddenly roared and turned around. He held a giant axe in his hand horizontally in front of him, and like a raging beast, he stood in front of Lu Chen. "Stop!" This roar was like a clap of thunder, instantly resounding through the entire hill. All the barbarians were stunned, and stopped in their tracks to look at the barbarian leader. Immediately, the barbarian leader waved his giant axe and roared, "Black Fire Warriors, come here." With this order, a group of barbarian warriors that looked incomparably valiant immediately responded. From the clothes and accessories on their bodies, these barbarian warriors were all from the same tribe. With a clatter, they all stood behind the barbarian leader. Facing more barbarian warriors around them, these barbarians of the Black Fire tribe did not have the slightest hesitation. They directly pulled out their weapons behind the leader and looked fiercely at their surroundings. There was no doubt that as long as the leader of the Black Fire tribe gave the order, these warriors of the Black Fire tribe would not hesitate to fight to the death with this group of people who were their comrades not long ago. "Hui Yen, what are you doing?" A shout came from the crowd, and a moment later, 3 people walked out. They all looked like the barbarian leaders. It was also at this time that the remaining barbarian warriors seemed to have a subtle atmosphere. They all retreated and gathered behind their leader, and then looked at the people of the other tribes around them with vigilance. Among the 3 barbarian leaders on the left, middle, and right, the one who shouted was the one on the left. Then, the eldest barbarian leader standing in the middle also shouted, "Hui Yen, we, the Black Fire, Thunder Lizard, Divine Wood, and Ghost Eye tribes, have joined hands to fight, and we are like brothers. Why are you suddenly pointing your blade at us? What do you mean?" The barbarian leader called Hui Yen, who stood in front of Lu Chen, had a cold expression. He was not moved by these words at all, and only said, "This person has nothing to do with you, I want to take him away." The barbarian warriors in the 3 tribes suddenly became restless. The leader of the Thunder Lizard tribe, who was wearing a terrifying lizard head ornament on his head, scolded, "Are you blind? That's not a barbarian, That's a human. Yes, how many years has it been since a human came to the southern border? He must be a spy. We must kill him. Have you forgotten the humiliation our ancestors suffered in the north? How many great heroic souls lost their lives in that land? They were all killed by the human race. For a moment, the emotions of the tribes were stirred up, and curses came one after another. Even the warriors of the Black Fire tribe seemed to be puzzled and doubtful. Although they still stood firmly behind their leader, Hui Yan, from time to time they would sneak glances at this leader who had suddenly become strange. Hui Yan's face was still ferocious and solemn, and it seemed that he had no intention of backing down. He slashed the giant axe in his hand in the air, and with a low roar, he looked around and said, "This is the power of the Black Fire, the sign of the resurrection of our fire god." His face was ferocious, and he glared at the three people in front of him. The killing intent in his eyes was not concealed, and he roared, "Whoever dares to touch him will have to step over the dead bodies of all the warriors of the Black Fire tribe." As soon as these words came out, the area under the sand dunes suddenly became silent. As for the warriors of the Black Fire tribe behind Hui Yan, they all seemed to have come to a sudden realization. With a whoosh, they immediately surrounded Lu Chen and Black Wolfatu. The sudden turn of events made Lu Chen a little stunned, and he couldn't come back to his senses for a while. While the warriors of the Black Fire tribe in front of him were prepared to fight to the death, many of them secretly looked back at him, as if they were full of curiosity towards Lu Chen. In front of the crowd, the leaders of the three tribes were also stunned. Soon, everyone remembered the scene that happened at the most intense moment of the battle. The rising flame power had obviously defeated the mountain spirit priest's earth's spiritual power, killed the priest, and destroyed the terrifying stone puppet. This was the key to turning the tide of the battle. For a moment, everyone was silent, and many of the barbarian warriors showed a trace of awe on their faces, and even put down the weapons they had raised. But at this time, the leader of the Ghost Eye tribe, the only one among the three who hadn't spoken, suddenly said with a cold gaze, "Hui Yan, are you trying to take a priest back?" Chapter 289. Snatch a priest back? Many of the barbarians who heard Hui Yan's words did not understand. Their faces were filled with astonishment and confusion. But soon, the expressions of the two barbarian leaders who stood at the front changed drastically. Their gazes immediately landed on Lu Chen, who was standing behind Hui Yan. In the southern wilderness, for every tribe, the people who mastered the power of witchcraft were the source of the tribe's prosperity. However, there were only a very small number of people who could perceive the incomparably chaotic spiritual power and use a special method to cultivate witchcraft. These people were known as priests. And among the priests, those who stood at the peak and were able to grasp the source of the spiritual energy of the southern territory were called shamans. Any tribe that lost a priest would not be able to maintain its prosperity. This was not only because of the weakening of the tribe's power, but also because the priest was often the wisest person in the tribe. For many years, shamans and priests had always guided the barbarian tribes of the southern wilderness. The barbarians believed in and worshipped witchcraft, and revered shamans and priests. Without the guidance of the priest, the tribe would eventually weaken, and they would fall into a predicament in the vast and harsh wilderness. Without the guidance of the priest's witchcraft and wisdom, the only thing they could rely on was the flesh and courage of the warriors in the tribe. However, these things were extremely fragile in the face of great power. A few years ago, the Mountain Spirit tribe was like the other four tribes. They didn't have a priest and struggled in the lower world of the wilderness. However, once they were influenced by a priest, the strength of the Mountain Spirit tribe rapidly expanded. Today, they could even fight against four people alone. The power of worship and belief of the Black Fire tribe had indeed appeared before. After the chief Ghost Eye explained, the other two tribal chiefs immediately understood. But understanding was one thing, but they still looked at Lu Chen in disbelief. That was a human. In the long history of the southern wilderness, there had never been a non-barbarian priest or shaman. But no one had ever said that the priest and shaman couldn't be a foreigner. A human was going to become a priest of the barbarian tribe? The few leaders and the barbarian warriors behind them, who were starting to understand the situation, even the barbarian warriors of the Blackfire tribe, all had their mouths wide open in shock. Lu Chen had also heard it himself. After understanding the meaning behind this matter, even though his temperament was much calmer than an ordinary person, he could not help but be greatly shocked. His gaze landed on the back of the abnormally tall and sturdy Huoyan. Obviously, this chief warrior of the Blackfire tribe had thought of all these in a short period of time. Then he decided to use all the warriors of the Blackfire tribe to fight against the other 3 tribes without any hesitation. Even Lu Chen himself felt that it was a little inconceivable. At this moment, Huoyan, who was being stared at by everyone, had a serious expression on his face. However, his expression was firm and he had no intention of backing down. He only said in a low voice, "Whether he is a priest or not, I don't know. This is up to the Blackfire tribe's chief to decide." But what appeared just now was the power of the fire god of our Blackfire tribe. No matter what, I must bring this person back. Whether he lives or dies will be decided by the chief. The other 3 tribes looked at each other, and the chiefs frowned. At the same time, the barbarian warriors seemed to have unknowingly spread out, gradually surrounding the Blackfire tribe. Huoyan's expression became even colder. He stared at the 3 chiefs and shouted, "Do you really want to fight to the death with the Blackfire tribe?" The 3 barbarian chiefs also looked hesitant. They looked at each other, then walked together and began to discuss in low voices. Actually, based on their current strength, none of the tribes had any priests. With 3 tribes against 1, the Blackfire tribe would definitely have the upper hand. But if the Blackfire tribe fought to the death, the 3 tribes would inevitably suffer some additional losses. The life of every barbarian warrior was precious. Although they could fight to the death for the tribe as a chief, they could not easily waste the lives of the warriors under them. Otherwise, the great ancestors of the tribe would curse them, and they would forever be despised by the tribe, and their souls would never be able to return to peace. While the other 3 tribes were discussing, the atmosphere between the barbarian warriors suddenly became even more tense. Although Huoyan's attitude seemed to be abnormally firm, in fact, his forehead and back were faintly covered in cold sweat. He only felt that his heart was abnormally heavy, as if there was a huge stone pressing down on it. Although the warriors of the Blackfire tribe would not question his decision, he himself had to think more. Was it really worth it for such a human? Cough, cough, cough. Just when the atmosphere was a little stiff, Huoyan suddenly heard a light cough coming from behind him. The sound sounded a little strange. Huoyan was startled for a moment. He turned around and saw that it was Lu Chen looking at him and giving him a look. Huoyan was silent for a moment, then quietly took 2 steps back and came to Lu Chen's side. His body was considered tall and burly among the barbarian warriors. At this moment, when Lu Chen stood beside him, he looked like a child who had just grown up. Huoyan lowered his voice, his expression slightly strange and complicated. He said in a low voice, "What do you want?" Lu Chen glanced at him and said, "Tell them that as long as they let us go, they will hand over all the treasures that you have plundered." Huoyan's expression suddenly changed, and a murderous aura instantly leaked out. He could not help but take a step towards Lu Chen. Some of the warriors of the Blackfire tribe who were closer also suddenly became furious. In an instant, several weapons were pointed at Lu Chen. It seemed that there was no need for the 3 tribes to do anything. Just based on what he said just now, the people of the Blackfire tribe couldn't wait to get rid of this fraud who might have the power of their tribe's fire god. Towards the murderous aura around him, Lu Chen did not seem to feel it. His eyes only stared at Huoyan. After a moment, he said coldly, "You want the power of the priest, so you don't believe my words?" Huoyan angrily growled, "These things were exchanged with the lives of my warriors. Why should I hand them over?" "You value this very much?" "Of course." "Do the 3 tribes value it?" "Of course." "Then you throw all these things to their warriors. If one tribe has more, another tribe has less, and one tribe doesn't give anything at all, what do you think the consequences will be?" Huoyan was just about to angrily speak, but suddenly his body fiercely shook. Immediately after, his eyes slowly widened. Looking at Lu Qin, a trace of shock and a complicated expression appeared in his eyes. That look, it was as if he had suddenly seen a ghost. Lu Qin sighed and softly said to Hui Yen, "Do you know what the priest's power is other than witchcraft?" Hui Yen was stunned for a moment, then suddenly turned around. His entire face seemed to be on fire, burning brightly. After letting out a low roar, he shouted to the surrounding warriors, "Hand over all the things that you have just plundered." Chapter 290. Ordering the Blackfire Tribe's barbarian warriors to hand over their loot was like seeing a starving dog and ordering it to spit out the bones it had painstakingly snatched. Most of the barbarian warriors in the surroundings didn't move after hearing the shout of their leader. They all widened their eyes and looked at Hui Yen as if they were looking at a madman. At the same time, some of the Blackfire Tribe's warriors looked at Hui Yen with hostility, but not at Hui Yen, who had gone through life and death with them. Instead, they looked at Lu Qin, the instigator of all this. They clenched their weapons tightly, looking as if they wanted to hack him to death. The barbarians were strong and fierce, and most of the warriors were simple-minded. Therefore, even when facing Hui Yen, they would show a bit of dissatisfaction. But no matter what, Hui Yen was still the chief. Seeing the expressions of the people around him, he also became angry. However, there was no such thing as tactful persuasion among the barbarians, so he directly chose the most common and most direct method. "Go to hell!" The tall and fierce barbarian cursed loudly. He kicked a barbarian warrior who was standing closest to him. Then he took a step forward and used his huge palms to smash anyone he saw. If he didn't like them, he would kick them. Along the way, the barbarians were thrown off their feet. The barbarians roared and roared continuously. The other barbarians who didn't know what was going on were stunned and looked at each other in dismay. Under the pressure of Hui Yen, all the Blackfire Tribe's warriors seemed to have become listless. With sullen faces, they obediently handed over the loot they had just obtained. In the blink of an eye, there was a huge pile of loot on the ground. Lu Qin looked at this scene from the side. He had a whole new level of respect for Hui Yen. He could tell that this person should be a person of great prestige in the Blackfire Tribe. So many fierce warriors actually didn't dare to make a sound in front of him. Not long after, almost all the loot from the Blackfire Tribe was piled up on the ground. Hui Yan's expression didn't look too good. No matter what, these bones were his own. He didn't feel good about throwing them away. Normally, he wouldn't do this even if he was beaten to death. But at this moment, things were different. As the leader of the tribe, his vision was much better than those subordinates who only knew how to fight, rob, and roar. This mysterious human possessed the power of black flames. In that instant, Hui Yen felt as if he had been blessed by his ancestors. He firmly believed that he had not done anything wrong. "These things are for you. We have helped you in this battle for nothing. Let us go." Hui Yen stood in front of the pile of spoils of war. His expression was steely, and he seemed to be gnashing his teeth as he spoke. The three leaders on the opposite side were shocked. The other barbarian warriors in the surroundings also became restless. Their eyes were filled with greed. The southern wilderness was barren and harsh. It was a good thing to have something in one's hands, even if it was snatched from the hands of the dead. The three leaders didn't expect the Blackfire Tribe to make such a big concession. It should be known that in all the tribal wars in the wilderness, the most important thing was to divide the spoils of war. Everyone fought and bled just to get more food, weapons, and other useful things. Perhaps the top few powerful tribes didn't care about these small things because they occupied the best resources in the wilderness and had the support of the terrifying shamans. But at least for the middle and lower level tribes, the things that the Blackfire Tribe threw out were the fundamental reason for them to start the war. Almost everyone was tempted. The only one who was still somewhat clear-headed was the leader of the Ghost Eye Tribe. But before he could object, Hui Yen had already started to divide the spoils. He grabbed and threw the spoils of war directly into the crowd on the opposite side. Immediately, a large group of barbarian warriors started to fight for them. However, he didn't know if it was intentional or not, But most of the items he threw landed on the Thunder Lizard tribe, and a small portion landed on the Divine Wood tribe. As for the Ghost Eye tribe, they didn't even have a single item. Of course, this immediately aroused the dissatisfaction and public anger of the Ghost Eye tribe. Angry shouts immediately came out. The barbarian warriors of the Ghost Eye tribe looked at the excited faces of the people from the Thunder Lizard tribe and the Divine Wood tribe who got the spoils of war, and their eyes turned red. However, Hui Yan's actions were extremely fast. He quickly threw out the last of the items, then waved his hand and led the rest of the Black Fire tribe to surround Lu Chen and Atu as they retreated down the sand dune. At the same time, Hui Yan walked at the back, his eyes shining as he stared at those people as they slowly retreated. There was a commotion among the three tribes on the sand dune. The leader of the Ghost Eye tribe cursed and was the first to rush out. But after a few steps, he suddenly stopped and looked back. He saw that the people of the other two tribes were still standing in the same place. The people of the Divine Wood tribe looked left and right. When they saw the Thunder Lizard tribe, there was envy in their eyes, but when they saw the Ghost Eye tribe, they suddenly felt a sense of superiority. After hesitating a few times, no one moved forward. As for the Thunder Lizard tribe, so many good things suddenly appeared on the ground. Originally, they had to bleed, sweat, and even risk their lives to get them. Only an idiot would follow the idiots of the Ghost Eye tribe and risk their lives. Therefore, a large group of people from the Thunder Lizard tribe were desperately fighting for the things on the ground. It looked like a group of dogs fighting for meat and bones. They didn't even look at the people of the Ghost Eye tribe. The leader of the Ghost Eye tribe flew into a rage and cursed loudly. He looked back at the retreating people of the Black Fire tribe and the tall and fierce figure. After hesitating for a while, he finally sighed and didn't chase after them. If he chased after them now, without the help of the Thunder Lizard tribe and the Divine Wood tribe, it would be equivalent to the Ghost Eye tribe fighting against the Black Fire tribe. Not to mention the fact that the outcome was uncertain. Even if the Ghost Eye tribe won, it would be a Pyrrhic victory. At that time, they would inexplicably lose the lives of more than half of the warriors of the tribe. If they couldn't destroy the Black Fire tribe, they would definitely have a blood feud with them. Most importantly, the Black Fire tribe had already King thrown out most of the things they had seized. Even if the Ghost Eye tribe won this battle, they wouldn't get many benefits. How could they fight this battle? No matter how they looked at it, they were at a disadvantage. There were many barbarians in the southern wilderness who risked their lives for revenge. But if the leader of a tribe was like that, his tribe would have been destroyed long ago. The leader of the Ghost Eye tribe hadn't encountered such a depressing situation for a long time. He looked at the backs of the people of the Black Fire tribe gradually getting further and further away, and then looked at the two tribes behind him who were still gloating. The leader of the Ghost Eye tribe looked up to the sky and sighed. "Priests, those are priests," he said with a sad face, "a bunch of idiots." You're tuning in to the Han Li's Immortal Journey YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.